Welcome, wrestling fans, to the Pro Wrestle Machine. Whether you're tuning in from the Great American Bash or halfway around the world, we've got a jam-packed episode for you. Get ready to dive into wrestling's rich history, packed with insights, opinions, and a few surprises. And remember, you can skip to your favorite moments with our chapter markers. Let's jump right into it. June 5, 2000 Observer Newsletter, Brian Pillman Memorial Show, Potential Shift in the Wrestling Landscape. By Dave Meltzer. The entire pro wrestling landscape is expected to change greatly over the next few weeks. But there would be no such thing as intelligent speculation on how it's going to end up. There are basic points of change for all three major companies in the United States. WWF is attempting to move its television from USA Network to what would become a revamped TNN, with Sunday Night Heat moving to MTV. This can affect ECW, which is also on TNN, in several different fashions, which could either be the greatest break the company has ever received, or its absolute death sentence. WCW is now on the blocks. With Ted Turner looking to leave the Time Warner/America Online conglomerate, the wrestling company, which Turner has always fought to keep in the family when outside offers came in, or during downtimes when major executives suggested shutting it down, is no longer protected, and it's coming at the worst time possible as the company is suffering from record losses. WWF may not be able to get out of its deal with USA, which might stagnate everything. There were even people speculating on the feasibility of WWF going to TNN, WCW going to USA, and ECW then winding up on TNT, but that's highly unlikely as neither TNT or TBS seem willing to allow its rights to the primetime WCW wrestling to go to their cable rivals at USA, since all three stations are battling for cable ratings superiority, and as bad as the wrestling ratings for WCW have dropped, neither TNT or TBS would be easily able to fill the primetime with shows drawing numbers in the same league. USA seemingly wants a Monday Night Wrestling franchise and doesn't want to make the mistake they feel they made of not owning the franchise outright and being put in this position of helping develop a cable dynasty and then losing the dynasty, which, if WWF leaves, seems to indicate either starting a new company, which would be next to impossible because all the major players are under contract, or going with and buying ECW, or potentially WCW, a very unlikely scenario. The other alternative is simply dropping wrestling. But if USA wants that wrestling on Monday nights, it would leave them with the number 3 company in an already cramped Monday night field. There is still the question WWF has to be nervous about, and that is what a move of Raw to TNN would mean to the ratings. There will be virtually no loss as far as potential homes, as USA is currently in about 77.5 million homes while TNN is in 76 million homes. SmackDown has proven the WWF audience will follow its programming to a new station, and has also proven WWF can be the cornerstone of a turnaround of an entire network, something TNN desperately is expecting it to be. There have been several high-level negotiations this past week involving WCW and ECW, most notably with SFX. SFX, which owns many arenas, has of late purchased concert tour rights for many leading concerts including Bob Dylan and Paul Simon. The deal they've done in those situations is book the tours themselves, because they own several major arenas, and can cut rental deals for other major arenas far better than anyone else can. They guarantee the performers in the case of the latter two, $250,000 per show. They've jacked up the ticket prices to $100 or more average per seat, something everyone readily admits would be death when it comes to promotion of live pro wrestling at this point in time, and sold tons of corporate sponsorships and commercials on the live screens during the show to help defray the costs. At one point earlier this year, SFX made a strong approach to buying WCW, which was immediately nixed by Turner. Exactly what is going on with these negotiations has been kept secretive, but there is talk the current negotiations with WCW do not include buying the company, but simply buying the promotional rights to the house shows, and the negotiations are in the beginning form. It is believed that TNT and TBS are wanting to maintain the television rights to the company, but none of the headaches and the losses that come with running it. At least 2 other groups have expressed interest in buying either WCW and or ECW, and there is always Fox Network, which has talked of doing wrestling, including negotiations in the past with Hulk Hogan, Eric Bischoff, and Randy Savage, but at this point doesn't appear to want to own the company but rather have a company provide product for a weekday afternoon show. On the May 31st Thunder Show, there is an interview with Bischoff and Tony Schiavone where Bischoff claims the big deal that will change the landscape of the wrestling industry was finalized earlier in the day. He said that the deal would be announced at the Great American Bash on June 9th, and brought up strongly that there is nothing Vince McMahon could do about it. WCW, recognizing that even putting Hogan and Flair's careers on the line, They are doing so poorly on pay-per-view that they are building this announcement up as the prime draw on the show. The surprise could be an SFX announcement, which would mean little to the general public, or be something as mundane as a Goldberg heel turn, as Goldberg was asked over the last week to go heel, but it didn't appear to be something he was thrilled about, and it's also something that on the surface seems like a terrible move at this time. It could be a great move at another time, similar to the botched heel turn they attempted last year for Sting. Politically, if you are wondering why, it leaves Hogan free and clear for the number 1 face position and Nash at number 2 without Goldberg potentially passing both of them by. It also leaves both of them with singles matches with Goldberg where, as faces, they would be able to look strong against him rather than eating him up. WCW has sent feelers to ECW about working together, something Bischoff discussed with Paul Heyman during the Mike Awesome legal battle of turning it into an angle, something a stagnant ECW may be more likely to consider, although Heyman said he has no interest in being a part of a WCW angle. Exactly what will happen with WCW at that point becomes a question. The company is losing money at a far greater rate than it did last year, when it still had strong buy rates and strong attendance until the summer when the freefall took hold, and where it ended up losing in excess of $15 million. There have been internal loss estimates starting at $36 million and growing from there based on different scenarios, with $55 to $60 million being a more likely figure and $80 million being a worst-case scenario. Even though Heyman insists he's not interested in selling a majority interest in ECW, he also has recognized based on this past year that in order to compete with the 2 monster promotions, he's going to need far more economic resources, as well as a stronger television outlet than he already has. The charm of ECW at its best, being the small-time cult thing, just doesn't play well enough on a national basis to provide enough revenue to keep much of the top talent from leaving. Heyman also admitted that he's in a precarious situation and that if they lose TNN, if McMahon wants exclusivity, and McMahon may not want exclusivity for the reason that if TNN keeps ECW but puts it in a non-threatening time slot, it guarantees ECW won't be put on Monday nights against Raw, which admittedly isn't much of a threat today, and ECW doesn't get a new outlet, it would be disastrous. There was another pro wrestling retirement of a Hall of Fame caliber candidate after someone lost on a major show this past week. At this point in time, that's not even news. But the unique career of Masakatsu Funaki, who from all accounts is at least at this moment serious about his retirement, from a career which climaxed and ended within 13 minutes on May 26 in the main event of the debut of the Coliseum 2000 promotion at the Tokyo Dome, is exemplified by the questions of what if? What if Funaki had stayed in traditional pro wrestling? He may have been, with his athletic ability, looks, youth and natural charisma, have been the biggest star in the Japanese wrestling world today. Funaki, 31, started out as a pro wrestler and became one of the biggest names in the martial arts world. Many fighters who opposed him in real matches during his prime several years back stated he was the greatest submission fighter in the world. But his record, certainly in recent years, didn't show that. Funaki was one of those mysterious people in the early days of the UFC where people would say if he entered a tournament, he'd clean up on everyone. But when the time came for him to actually enter the Vale Tudo world, a world at first he dismissed because he felt it was brutal fighting as opposed to sport fighting, he was admittedly past his physical prime because of so many hard fights in the grueling Pancrase circuit and the results were not impressive. He ended with a 2-1-1 under Vale Tudo rules with a draw with Ebenezer Fontes Braga that he would have lost had there been judges and wins over unknowns like John Renkin and Tony Patara that weren't close to his league. In a match that itself was a major disappointment for what was billed as a match of the century in Japan to the crowd that came to see Funaki finally win the big one, it was Rickson Gracie, 40, of Brazil, the mythical greatest fighter in the world before there were actual competitions where people could prove such a thing and who had never beaten up to this point someone who would be considered today as a top-level fighter. His biggest real win may have been against Yoshihisa Yamamoto, who at the time had never had a high-level shoot match in his career, who brought the supporters of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu back after their recent defeats at the hands of Japanese. Funaki, the greatest submission fighter and legend who did at least at certain times prove himself against top fighters, went into a match that most fighters considered him the favorite to dominate, if not win, with the question in the latter due to the unique no time limit and no stoppage rules which figured to make it a very long grueling fight which overall conditioning could decide. As it turned out, Gracie won far too easily in the eyes of most people, in 12:49, with a choke sleeper, and many couldn't come up with a reasonable explanation of why Funaki was so ineffective in the closing moments of the fight. It was almost a similar situation to Nobuhiko Takada, where all his reputation as a shooter from worked pro wrestling matches, and even worse in the case of Funaki, because he had fought so many real matches, was shot because his most memorable match saw him lose too easily, because he offered no defense when Gracie got the advantage, and because he has done so many jobs in the past in what were supposed to have been shoot matches. The obvious question is being asked, except there is no logical explanation why he'd do a job in this match. It was the big win the Gracie family needed after Hoisa's loss on May 1st to Kazushi Sakuraba in their 90 Minutes Classic in the same building. After the loss, Funaki in the dressing room, said to be terribly despondent with his performance, announced his retirement. The show itself drew a crowd announced at 40,240 fans to the Dome, although the real figure was closer to 25,000. It was actually the smallest crowd for a pro wrestling type event ever at the Dome. And even though every match on the show appeared to be a shoot, this was a complete pro wrestling crowd weaned on the old UWF, and it appeared more fans of rings than Pancrase, but with a top ticket price at nearly $1,800 and virtually no freebies available, the gate was huge. Most impressive was the TV rating for the show, a 12.6 on TV Tokyo Channel 12, one of the weaker stations in the Japanese market, peaking at 17.5 for the climax of the main event, which aired from 10 to 11 p.m. on a tape delay that evening. The only other pro wrestling show at the Tokyo Dome to draw a crowd in the 25,000 range was also headlined by Funaki, back in 1992, when doing pro wrestling for Pro Wrestling Fujiwara Gumi, in a mixed match draw against kickboxer Maurice Smith. Because of the success of the match on television, TV Tokyo was talking about wanting to use Gracie next year for another Tokyo Dome event billed as Coliseum 2001, possibly with Naoya Ogawa. The Gracie vs. Funaki match saw the first 5 minutes standing near the ropes. Gracie was unsuccessfully trying to bring Funaki to the ground, and Funaki landed some good punches and knees, which ended up swelling one of Gracie's eyes. They ended on the ground with Funaki on top, but he got up quickly and tried to keep the fight standing, where he appeared to have a more decisive advantage. Gracie wouldn't stand, so Funaki started leg kicking him, but wasn't effective at the strategy, and Gracie was able to take him down. There was one report, which may explain why Funaki looked so ineffective afterwards, that stated Gracie managed from the bottom to kick Funaki's knee. However, there was no post-match explanation that Funaki suffered a knee injury. Gracie dominated Funaki on the ground surprisingly easily, got the mount and pounded on him several times, bloodying him up. Funaki turned his back and Gracie got a choke before the match was stopped when Yoshiki Takahashi, Funaki's second, threw in the towel at 12:49 of their no-time limit match. This was the fight where the only way Gracie could lose was to tap, as the referee, ringside doctors and even his own corner couldn't stop the fight. Luckily, a bad situation didn't occur based on Gracie being allowed to demand his own rules. The end rules also banned both usage of elbows, which may not have been finalized until 1 hour before the event started, and headbutts, also rules demanded by Gracie and opposed by Funaki. If Gracie was seriously injured in a match with those rules, it could be brutal to the future of events of this type. In the dressing room, Funaki announced his retirement from Pancrase and MMA fighting. This may leave the door open to go back to pro wrestling, where some say Funaki made the worst career decision of his life to abandon, even though he, probably more than any other, was responsible for the popularity of real fighting in Japan. With the right angle, Funaki could be a huge draw with New Japan, but traditional pro wrestling is a world he left 11 years earlier, in a world that has changed greatly in that period. The belief was Funaki had already decided that win or lose, he was retiring after this match. From the start of Pancrase, the first organization that presented pro wrestling matches predominantly, but not exclusively, that were shoots in 1993, Funaki had fought 52 matches, all but a few in the physically taxing Pancrase style, which virtually all fighters who have done both say is harder on the body than UFC style, ending with a 39-12-1 record. He held the King of Pancrase title on 2 occasions, with wins over Jason DeLucia, a title lost to Yuki Kondo where it certainly appeared he was giving the title to his protege in the attempts of making him a star, taking it back with an easy win over Kondo in a rematch, and a loss of the title to Guy Mesger in a match where he had clearly passed his prime and never really looked like the old Funaki after that point. His September 7, 1995 loss to Boss Rutan in a championship match is considered in Japan as the only match that was a crossover on the charts, in that it is considered one of the greatest pro wrestling matches ever and one of the greatest martial arts matches ever. It should be noted that several of his losses in Pancrase, and nobody knows just how many, were matches that he did jobs and to get talent over for the perceived good of the Pancrase business. If there was no Funaki, there is zero question that Pancrase would have never made it. He was the top draw from the first day of the company to the present, and the company's popularity is without question going to take a step downward without him. The funny thing is that many think he never should have done real matches because he was destined to be one of the biggest pro wrestling superstars of this past and this next decade. Masaharu Funaki was born on March 13, 1969 in Hirosaki, Japan, and took Bruce Lee as his childhood hero and started weight training young. When he was in junior high school, it was the Satoru Sayama era of Japanese pro wrestling, and Sayama's success led to him wanting to try pro wrestling. In March of 1984, just after his 15th birthday, he went to the New Japan dojo to try out. He took to things so quickly that he was the star of the class and made his New Japan debut at the age of 15 on March 3, 1985 against Tatsutoshi Goto, and is still the youngest major league pro wrestler ever in Japanese history. He trained alongside the likes of Keiichi Yamada, who was somewhat of a teacher of him in the dojo because Yamada started about 1 year earlier, and Chris Benoit, as well as numerous others, and was more talented in the dojo than either of the two men who later would be considered two of the greatest workers that ever lived. He trained in Koppo, and later became roommates with Minoru Suzuki, who along with Funaki and Ken Shamrock, were responsible for the first real high-level pro wrestling organization of modern times when Pancrase was formed years later. Funaki quickly became a cult hero in Japan of the hardcore fans and somewhat to teenage girls. Before he ever had a television appearance, his prelim matches in the hardcore buildings like Sumo Hall in Tokyo would see him get huge pops for his entrance and his quick, athletic moves. New Japan sent him to Europe in April 1988, where he became a star in Germany, England, and Austria before returning 1 year later. On his return, he made the decision that changed his career and in many ways the face of pro wrestling in Japan in the long run, jumping from New Japan to the UWF, a new group doing what was purported to be shooting matches. They were actually very realistic-looking works, but at the time, due to the uniqueness of the style, had become the hottest wrestling promotion in the world at the time. Funaki became the hottest new star in the promotion in his matches against the likes of Yoshiaki Fujiwara, Nobuhiko Takada, and a strange match where he destroyed and pummeled Bob Backlund en route to getting disqualified. By 1990, Funaki was being pushed to the point he scored wins over Takada and Fujiwara in succession to build to a match in Osaka against the company's biggest star, Akira Maeda, which Maeda went over in. The UWF, due to financial mismanagement and the various wrestlers all getting offers to form their own companies, fell apart shortly after that, with Funaki beating Shamrock on the final UWF show. Funaki, Suzuki, and Shamrock went with Fujiwara's PWFG in the three-sided breakup in 1991, which led to the formation of Rings by Maeda and UWFI with Takada as the top star. Within PWFG there was divisiveness as Funaki, Suzuki, and Shamrock wanted to be the top stars, but Fujiwara, who was in his early 40s, kept himself on top and wouldn't put the younger wrestlers over. They also talked about the idea of actually doing real matches, as opposed to worked matches billed as real, which was a concept so revolutionary to pro wrestling that nobody thought it could be feasible over the long haul. The UWF-style promotions did occasional shoots, usually with their well-trained wrestlers going against less skilled outsiders who would get thrashed. Finally, at the end of 1992, the three quit PWFG and started the formation of Pancrase, which debuted on September 21, 1993 at Tokyo Bay NK Hall with an all-shoot show which saw most of the matches last less than 2 minutes except the main event where Shamrock beat Funaki with a choke in 5 minutes. In shoot matches, Funaki did submit people like Minoru Suzuki in his prime, Maurice Smith, Boss Rutan, Guy Mesger, and even got a win over Ken Shamrock. Also on the Dome show. 1. Yuki Kondo of Pancrase knocked out Saulo Ribeiro of Brazil in 22 seconds. Ribeiro, the top student of Royler Gracie who recently won the Abu Dhabi tournament, went for a takedown and got caught with a knee to the forehead and was bleeding profusely. Kondo delivered several more punches before the match was stopped. This match ended up being the second most publicized match on the show afterwards because the main event was such a disappointment and letdown. 2. In a Kyokushin karate match, Kunihiro Suzuki beat Luciano Basile by unanimous decision after 15 minutes. Match was said to have been boring. 3. In a kickboxing match, Masato beat Melkor Manor via knockout in 2:50 of the 4th round. The audience, primarily pro wrestling fans, weren't interested in this match. 4. Genki Sudo, a Pancrase fighter with a lot of charisma since he grew up as a pro wrestling fan, went to a 15 minutes draw with Andre Pederneiras, a well-known BJJ practitioner. There were no judges in this match, but Sudo, a protege of Rutan, would have won had there been a decision, because he landed good punches and knees and Pederneiras did little on offense. 5. Mario Sperry beat Hiromitsu Kanehara of Rings via a majority decision after going 15 minutes. Sperry threw Kanehara around and out-grappled him, getting his back and mounting him several times. Sperry continually went for submissions, but Kanehara was able to escape. Sperry reportedly never threw a punch, deciding to go for the win purely with grappling skill. 6. Kiyoshi Tamura of Rings won a unanimous decision over Jeremy Horn after going 15 minutes. Tamura got the second biggest pop coming out on the show behind Funaki. This was reportedly a great fight with both men looking good. Tamura was more aggressive earlier, although most reports indicated it was a very close fight. On their feet, Tamura had stronger kicks, but Horn had stronger punches. In some ways, it has to be considered a major feather in Tamura's cap to come back just 5 weeks after taking such a beating from Gilbert Yvel, and beat a top-level fighter who has him by 25 pounds. 7. Hicks and Gracie beat Masakatsu Funaki in 12:49 with a choke sleeper in a battle of mid-90s fighting legends. The memories of former wrestler Brian Pillman and popular referee Brian Hildebrand, along with a sensational comeback by Steven Regal, were the big stories coming from a very strange Brian Pillman Memorial Show on May 25 at the Schmidt Field House at Xavier University in Cincinnati. The event was held in conjunction with a fantasy wrestling camp the previous day to benefit Pam Hildebrand, the widow of Brian, known to wrestling fans as referee Mark Curtis in Smoky Mountain Wrestling and later WCW, who passed away on September 8 after a lengthy battle with cancer. The house show drew more than 2,000 largely appreciative fans to see what has, after 3 years in existence, turned into probably the most publicized independent pro wrestling event of the year in the United States, as wrestlers from all 3 major offices participated. It was a very strange atmosphere at times. There were independent and developmental talent trying to show off in front of the largest audience or highest profile event most would appear on during the course of the year. There were veterans from the big companies, giving up their days off in midweek, with a road schedule that is arduous enough to begin with, and working voluntarily to benefit the family of Pillman, a wrestler who passed away in 1997 from heart failure and who in many ways has grown to be a larger star in death than he was in life. The positives of the show were that it raised a figure estimated by the end of the night of $36,693 for the family, the largest total yet. The figure may turn out to be substantially higher since there were 2 large pledges not included in the figure by Kevin Nash and David Arquette, who is going to split his WCW earnings 3 ways, with 1/3 going to Hildebrand's widow, Pillman's widow and Darren Drozdov, a figure estimated to be $15,000 to $18,000 for each. In many ways, it is events like this one, or a similar event for Gary Albright, where promotions put aside political differences and greed. That is where the wrestling industry puts its best foot forward. Most of the matches, taken individually, were good, although the show lasted nearly 6 hours, which is simply too long, but it probably a necessary evil given what it attempts to accomplish as far as giving the younger talent a chance to be seen in good matches by an audience that travels from across the country to the show rather than rushed through as prelim fodder. There was also the strange situation of Kevin Nash offering $20,000 to the Pillman family if Missy Hite were to strip down to her bra and panties in front of what was largely a family audience, and later Diamond Dallas Page trying to raise money by having bidding for taking a dress off local valet Helena Heavenly. The crowd was unique, appreciative of most everything, polite for the most part when spots were missed, and enthusiastic for nearly every style the wrestlers tried to deliver. Without question, the star of the event was Regal, 32, whose career was considered dead and buried not all that long ago because of repeated problems with drugs. Regal, who had lost jobs in WCW on 2 occasions and WWF once, largely due to drug and the resulting conditioning problems, had his best match in many years with Chris Benoit, a 4 1/4 match that was better than all but maybe 2 matches held so far this year on pay-per-view, and was every bit as good as Benoit's Nitro Classic on October 4 in Kansas City with Bret Hart. Both wrestlers received a standing ovation at the finish, but in particular Regal, whose name was chanted by fans loudly by the end of the match. Regal was busted open hard way early as the two had a head-butting contest that would end when one was bleeding. The match contained no gimmicks, objects, tables, or ref bumps. There were maybe 1 or 2 times the wrestlers even bounced off the ropes. But the crowd response was easily double the intensity of any match on the show, and probably all but the top matches held so far this year. It was your typical New Japan or All Japan style match with top wrestlers, starting slow and building to perfectly executed and timed great moves and near falls, as well as submission moves that got over, as the biggest pop was for the crossface. When it was over, Leigh Thatcher, who has put together all 3 Pillman shows, went on the house mic and said it succinctly: "Ladies and gentlemen, you have just seen a wrestling match." It is ironic that much of Regal's problems in their own way were linked with Benoit. Regal suffered 2 knee injuries in different matches with Benoit, which he links to both the beginning and the worsening of his painkiller problems. He was also in a car wreck with Benoit, which banged himself even worse and led to more of a drug dependency. Now cleaned up and in probably the best shape of his career while doubling as something of a coach and main event wrestler for the WWF Memphis Championship Wrestling Developmental Territory, he had what he was calling earlier in the day the single most important match of his life. The match stood out on a show of largely good matches. Vampiro vs. Captain Rection was a hard-hitting brawl all over the building featuring both men diving off a relatively low balcony with Vampiro winning. Vampiro got a 100% face reaction. ECW had a title match with Justin Credible against Raven, which was very similar but slightly better than their television match from Minneapolis a few weeks earlier. Credible coming out also got a surprisingly strong face reaction. The main event on the show started as Eddie Guerrero vs. D'Lo Brown, but turned into Guerrero and Brown beating Dean Malenko and Perry Saturn in a tag match. The bout, which started at 11:05 p.m. on a card that began at about 5:30 p.m. in a hot building with no air conditioning, was not the match the four probably would have liked to have had, although it was still better than 85% of the matches on Nitro. Besides the unique attempt to raise money by Nash, and yelled at by Hyatt in a non-scripted moment about not stripping because this was an audience with a lot of children present, although Hyatt did do a dance and give brief glimpses of her underwear. Nash said after Hyatt kind of put him down that he would donate the money and write the check for $20,000 anyway in the morning to a Big Pop. At press time the check hadn't been written. It was very strange the number of no-shows for a benefit show, most without giving reasons. Ric Flair had canceled several days ahead of time, and David Flair also didn't attend. Terry Taylor canceled due to suffering what was believed to be a concussion in an angle on Nitro a few days earlier and not being able to fly. Chris Condito and Tammy Sitch missed the show, claiming at first that their airplane had caught fire and would be delayed, but when Condito left that word early in the afternoon, it was generally conceded they wouldn't be there. Road Dogg, Al Snow and Jim Cornette also didn't appear with nobody knowing why. Conan, who was never advertised, nor ever contacted about appearing, volunteered to attend at the last minute largely due to a request from Melanie Pillman through Elliot Pollock, who wanted he and Rey Mysterio Jr. there because of how well they treated her son Brian Jr. last year, ended up suffering the tricep injury on Thunder and being unable to attend. The crowd was also appreciative of the undercard matches largely involving independent talent. Unfortunately, doing the live internet show as some of these matches were taking place made it impossible to really see them. Jeremy Lopez and Rory Fox, who has the cult following from his appearance on the MTV Wrestling Special, both looked impressive in an opening tag match. GQ Masters, a local manager for Thatcher's Heartland Wrestling Association, looked to be ready for the big time with his poise in working the crowd before an Ohio Valley wrestling match with Rico Constantino, who people told me looked impressive, and BJ Payne. Also impressive to many was Sean O'Hare, a huge WCW developmental guy, who worked with Chuck Palumbo. O'Hare looked to be about 6'6" with the bodybuilder look, and Thatcher said he was even more agile than Don Leo Jonathan, the original agile giant from the 60s and 70s who until the Bruiser Brody/Vader era was considered the greatest working big man ever in pro wrestling. Flash Flanagan of Ohio Valley was probably the best worker on the undercard and one of the 4 or 5 best workers on the entire show. He was in a tag match with Cody Hawk and Anthony McMurphy beating Flanagan and Matt Stryker that the crowd really got into and was equal to any match on the show except the Benoit Regal match. Shark Boy and Jamie Sand had a solid match for the HWA Junior title as well. Ray Steele, who captured the HWA Heavyweight title, who is still green, showed a lot of potential as a 255-pounder doing high-flying moves a la Mike Awesome. Besides Nash and Hyatt, Diamond Dallas Page also appeared on the show, as did Shane Douglas. Douglas did one of those annoying "it's a shoot" interviews regarding Ric Flair, which the fans didn't like, claiming the reason he wasn't at the show last year was because Flair insisted on him not attending, and then mentioned how he finally got his match with Flair and beat him so badly that Flair didn't attend this year, and Hulk Hogan, which the fans cheered Douglas when he started doing the promo, to build heat for DDP to give him the diamond cutter. In the atmosphere of this particular show, the Flair/Hogan promos in the nature they were delivered may have been out of place, but in the spirit of Brian Pillman, whose attempts to blur the line between fantasy and reality to be able to work those few in the business who thought they were the only ones in on the work, when in fact, they were the specific ones designed to be worked and even to this day probably aren't fully aware of it. Maybe it was the most apropos thing on the show. There were 2 very different episodes of the Jim Rome Last Word show on Fox Sports Net over the past week, which resulted in a lot of headlines. The first, on May 24th, causing a furor among MMA fans, was an embarrassment of a show which saw Rome heavily rip the sport, saying it wasn't a sport, and its fans calling the event a freak show. but also saying it shouldn't be banned, calling it dangerous and barbaric. On May 29, Bret Hart guested on the show, which surprisingly wound up in a discussion about unionization of pro wrestlers. Rome on this issue agreed that wrestlers need a union. Hart noted that even rodeo clowns have unions, and said the argument that has been made about unionization hurting the salaries of the top wrestlers he doesn't buy because basketball and hockey have unions, and he didn't believe that hurt Wayne Gretzky or Michael Jordan's earning power. Hart shied away from issues involved in the lawsuit, but did criticize the WWF and Vince McMahon in particular for continuing the show after his brother's death. When the Raw tribute show the next night was brought up, Hart was critical of the show, and in particular Steve Austin, who had publicly on many occasions spoken of his dislike for Owen, raising a beer can at a video wall as the built-up climax of the show. The subject of the Survivor Series was never brought up by either party, and Rome, who often shows disdain for his guests after they leave, clearly liked Hart. In his last word, he was totally in agreement with what he said. Hart didn't limit his criticism to WWF, as he complained about the stunts required in WCW, in particular when he, with a concussion, jumped in a car to race off when Goldberg was chasing him. The car skidded on ice and he nearly drove into a production truck, in the same skit where Goldberg punched through the window and suffered the injury that kept him out for the past 6 months. Hart complained about the quality of the matches in general in wrestling and the mentality of newer wrestlers to do moves they can hit 8 out of 10 times rather than concentrate on moves that are safer and less dangerous. Hart seemed far more clear than he did for his off-the-record interview, although the OTR interview, because of the deeper subject matter, was a better television show. Rome on 2 occasions were completely disdainful of the WWF as it regarded not canceling the show in Kansas City last year, first saying the continuation of the show was one of the worst things he's ever heard about and called the decision cold-blooded. Later in his last word rant, which was much shorter than usual, Rome repeated that thought, saying the continuing on with the show was the most cold-hearted thing he's ever seen. On May 25, Rome had UFC fighter John Lewis, IFC promoter Paul Smith, and Lawrence Mandelker, a representative of the foes of UFC, as part of the New York State Athletic Commission. Rome was clearly anti-UFC from the start, as at the end of the clips to precede the interview, he simply said, "That's hideous." Mandelker's arguments for UFC being banned are that they don't allow bar-room brawls in the state. The arguments back and forth clearly showed Mandelker to be totally out of touch with what the sport is. His biggest complaint was the lack of rounds and the lack of judges, both of which exist now and did exist under the guidelines the New York legislature agreed to when they legalized the sport, and then reversed their stance due to critical articles in the New York Times in early 1997. It was that period that nearly killed UFC, because when the New York legislature voted to ban the sport in New York, cable companies, most notably Time Warner, were pressured to stop showing the events, decisions that haven't been overturned because within the cable industry the simple answer remains: is it legal in New York? The introductory piece was filled with misinformation, such as the sport is illegal in 40 states, actually it's closer to 11. At one point in the piece the sport was referred to as ultimate boxing. The basic argument started with Mandelker talking about the lack of judges and rounds, which was refuted since both exist. Mandelker then tried to call in question the integrity of the judges, which Smith said picking judges should be the job of the Athletic Commission to begin with. It was really sad after all the recent boxing pay-per-views to have a boxing supporter cast aspersions at the judging in other sports. Not that UFC judging has been perfect and there haven't been bad decisions, but nothing along the lines of what boxing has delivered. Rome even thought the referees didn't have the power to stop the matches, and they continued until fighters were brutalized, saying in boxing the referee is there to protect the boxer and can call for the bell as the fighter is in trouble, and in MMA, that's just the beginning of the fight. Rome tried to bring up a discussion whether UFC was more dangerous than boxing, but it went nowhere. Mandelker, who was so far behind the times that he thought there were 2 major organizations, UFC and Extreme Fighting, which folded in 1997, brought up if UFC had safety concerns, how come the fighters don't wear protective headgear, which Lewis and Smith quickly noted how come boxers and judo players aren't required to wear the headgear. Where Lewis and Smith looked bad was Smith talking about in 80 years of the sport that there has never been a fatality, and Mandelker quickly brought up that guy in Russia, Douglas Dedge, who he knew about but didn't know the circumstances of. Smith responded that was in an unsanctioned event. Quite frankly, the no fatality argument is somewhat bogus. Trying to argue that MMA fighting is not potentially dangerous is a lie. The argument should be, is it more dangerous than sports that are already legalized such as boxing and kickboxing, and the answer in both cases is it is not more dangerous and probably less dangerous because far more strikes to the head, knockouts and concussions take place in both of those sports, which are the injuries one needs to watch out for. I will never argue with someone who believes pro boxing should be banned about the legalization of UFC, but unless one also agrees boxing and kickboxing should be banned, any arguments about UFC from a danger standpoint are hypocritical. Lewis did mention many times, and was never caught in this argument, that UFC simply combines elements legal in all sports. For example, since there was a big discussion regarding chokes on the show, where Mandelker came off badly saying how they were dangerous and Smith and Lewis quickly brought up that chokes are legal in judo in the Olympic Games, Mandelker weakly came back that judo is a controlled sport and UFC isn't, citing that judo has referees, judges and doctors at ringside. However, Smith and Lewis didn't respond quickly enough to make that statement as foolish as it was, since UFC is all of the same and had them in 1997 when it was banned in New York. However, I don't know of any sport other than Vale Tudo, MMA or whatever we are calling what UFC falls into, where punching someone on the ground is legal. Mandelker, realizing he was losing the argument overall, said that the proponents of UFC, praising the fighters as well-conditioned athletes, have very persuasive arguments, the same ones they had in 1997 when the state legalized it and then changed its tune because the public was outraged. The reality was the public didn't care, but the New York Times, which took no time to understand the pros or the real cons of the sport, was outraged. Where MMA fans were furious was that during the debate, Rome acknowledged that eye gouging and fish hooking were illegal, but in his closing statement spoke of them as if they were legal. Rome's final comments on the subject were, "Is it a sport? Absolutely not. It is a freak show. Is it deplorable? Absolutely. Should the government ban the event? I don't think so. Hey look. If there are people who want to participate in and watch human cockfighting, so be it. If they don't care, why should I care if some guy wants to get his face rubbed up against the steel grate? Of course it's dangerous and barbaric, and certainly there are more noble ways to make a living than eye gouging and fish hooking your fellow man. It's despicable. But it should be legal. In fact, the one thing that scares me more than the fighters themselves is the fact that there is an audience demanding to see this." Due to Memorial Day weekend, only sketchy ratings information is available at press time. SmackDown on May 25th drew a 4.43 rating, which would be equivalent to a realistic 5.21 rating, and 7.8 share, which is well down from what the show had been doing, and that's with most of television in reruns. The show peaked at 5.16 for The Undertaker vs. Shane main event. It will be interesting over the long haul with so much of a new audience being built around Austin and Rock as megastars and Triple H as being their main foil, that building a show around Undertaker really saw the ratings take a plunge. Thunder on May 24th drew a 2.1 rating, which was down largely because the show started 48 minutes late due to NASCAR coverage. Roller Jam was preempted for a World of Outlaws special, which drew an 0.60. ECW on May 26th drew an 0.79 rating and a 1.5 share. The triple_A/EMLL block on Galavision on May 23rd drew a 1.6 Hispanic rating. Mexico. With his release from WCW, La Parka is starting to work far more frequently here as a regular, including working for EMLL as a regular for the first time in his career. He was always a AAA wrestler during his glory days in Mexico. He worked on May 26th in Tijuana, teaming with Super Parka against Villanos 4 and 5 and debuting at Arena Coliseo in Mexico City for EMLL on May 21st in the main event, teaming with Villano Tercero against Apollo Dantes and Pierroth Jr., with Parka's team winning via DQ to set up a rematch on May 28th. We have a correction regarding the mask. El Hijo del Santo versus Mask. El Hijo del Gladiador versus WWA welterweight title, Blue Panther trios match that we listed as taking place on May 31st. May 31st is actually the date scheduled for a contract signing for the match. There is belief that it'll end up just being Santo versus Gladiador with the belt versus the mask, and that Panther will lose the belt to one of the other two. May 31st at Arena Coliseo will be Ricky Marvin and Super Cacao versus Fugaz and Tony Rivera in a Parejas Increíbles match, and the losing team members face each other in a hair versus hair match. At a AAA show in Monterrey on May 21st, they had a cage match battle royal where the loser, last man left in, either unmasks or gets his head shaved, and it came down to relative unknown El Potro 2, who was revealed as Lucio Francisco Galvan Rodriguez. On a competing show in the same city on May 21st, Tarzan Boy beat El Satanico to keep the NWA Light Heavyweight title, and in a semifinal trios match, Santo beat Panther via submission to set up a WWA Welterweight title match between the two on May 28th. At Arena Mexico on May 26th, Negro Casas and Tarzan Boy and Emilio Charles Jr. beat Shocker and Scorpio Jr. and Bestia Salvaje in the main event. They are continuing the angle where Lush, the mascot for Team Ablis Sr., has been kidnapped as Violencia and a mysterious masked man came to ringside holding Lush in a cage to distract the Technicos. The June 2nd main event will be Pero Oguayo vs Mascara Ano 2000 in a non-stip singles match. All Japan. Kenta Kobashi retained the Triple Crown, beating Yoshihiro Takayama on May 26 in Niigata before a sellout 3,500 fans, getting the finish after a lariat in 21-20. In the other top match on the show, Toshiaki Kawada and Akira Taue beat Monokia Mossman and Jun Akiyama in 14:02 with a choke slam. On May 28 at Korakuen Hall, they had a surprising result, not so much that Johnny Ace and Mike Barton beat Toshiaki Kawada and Tomo Honda, but that it was Kawada doing a clean job for the double impact, the Old Road Warriors Doomsday device, and that the match only went 4:37. Also on that show, former sumo Takeshi Rikyo made his debut teaming with Masao Inoue to lose to Jun Akiyama and Takeshi Morishima when Akiyama beat Rikyo using a Boston Crab in 14:59. May 17th TV show drew a 3.4 rating, which is way up from the previous shows since the time shift to Wednesday after midnight, as the best rating All Japan had previously done in the slot was a 1.3. The huge difference is because the May 17th was a career retrospective of Jumbo Tsuruta. New Japan. Antonio Inoki, who did the angle with Riki Choshu at the Fukuoka Dome, talked about the Choshu vs Atsushi Onita match on July 30th. He said a Choshu vs Onita match in the long run would damage New Japan. Obviously, when Onita wrestled Great Muta last year, while the match sold a lot of tickets, the end result was probably a strong negative for the company because the fans were so unhappy with the show and New Japan went down in the Tokyo area. He said that Choshu had nothing to gain from doing the match and would rather see them kill each other than the electric dynamite match that is Onita's specialty. Inoki then said he doesn't like it when wrestlers tell a lie. There is some irony in there, isn't there? Since Choshu said he retired and has returned. Choshu told the press on May 27 that he's back training twice a day and has dropped 12 pounds already, trying to get down to 253. Onita said he would bring a secret major name to ringside with him at the match and that it wouldn't be Inoki. On May 29, Onita revealed the name as Economic Planning Agency Director General Taichi Sakaya, 64, famous Japanese politician. Sakaya, who is known to be a pro wrestling fan of Mayumi Ozaki, did not say if he would be appearing. New Japan is putting tickets on sale for the show from $47.50 up through $190 without mentioning anything except the main event. Results from the Super Junior tournament matches, which are prelim matches on these cards. On May 24 in Takaoka before 1,500, Kendo Kashin pinned Kid Romeo and El Samurai beat Shinya Makabe. On May 26 in Kasugai before 4,000, Katsuhiro Takaiwa pinned Dr. Wagner Jr. and Minoru Tanaka beat Kashin submit to a knee cross. On the May 27th show in Soka before 2,300, Koji Kanemoto beat Takaiwa via submission in 14:09. On the May 28th show in Nagano before a sellout 3,300, Kashin beat Minoru Fujita via submission with an armbar in 5:57 and Kanemoto beat Makabe in 10:37 with an Achilles tendon submission. On that show, Yuji Nagata, Manabu Nakanishi and Yutaka Yoshi confronted TV announcer Tsuji, obviously in an angle, and told him they shouldn't be talking about private problems on television, and Nakanishi put Tsuji in the claw. On May 29 in Saku before 1,600 in the only tournament match, Atani pinned Romeo in 5:37. Romeo got good reviews on this tour. The next tour will be June 25 to July 20 with the final show in Sapporo at the Doritsu Center Gym. Among those working the tour are Scott Norton, Mike Enos, Robbie Rage, formerly of High Voltage who had basically disappeared from the scene, and Negro Casas. May 20th TV show drew a 4.1 rating. Other Japan notes. Wellington Wilkins Jr., 39, who also wrestles as Beef Wellington as kind of the company policeman and submission trainer for Michinoku Pro Wrestling, was arrested on May 26 by Tokyo police attempting to smuggle drugs past customs by airmail to Pulsio Sapena, 39, of Thailand in late April for sale in Japan. Michinoku Pro has dropped Wilkins at this point due to the news, which made every major newspaper in Japan since drugs are a hot-button issue in that country. Rings ran on May 26 in Russia for a show that included numerous regulars from the Japan circuit including Andrei Kopylov, Valentin Overeem, Fold Han, who has disappeared from Japanese matches now that Rings in Japan has gone to the all-shoot format, Ilyakhin Mikhail, Renato Babalu, Bram Zaza, Chris Haseman, and Borislav Zhelyazkov. Haseman was upset by Yuri Bekachev by a knockout in only 2:30. Zaza beat America's most durable fighter Travis Fulton with a heel hook in 1:20. The only of the regular Japanese wrestlers on the show, Yasuhiro Namikawa, lost via decision to Han. Kopylov won the main event over Brazilian Carlos Clayton in 55 with an armbar. Sasuke the Great Masao Orihara held a press conference claiming to have raised 200 million yen, which would be just under $2 million US, which sounds like a totally believable number for an indie group, for a winner-take-all tournament on July 12 at Korakuen Hall for his new promotion called Michinoku Gumi. It will be a 6-team trios tournament. Teams announced so far are Tiger Mask and Great Sasuke and Minoru Fujita representing Michinoku Pro Sasuke the Great, and 2 mystery partners representing Michinoku Gumi. Rivals for Michinoku Pro obviously, Sanshiro Takagi and Exciting Yoshida, and a mystery partner representing the small DDT promotion, Shima and Suwa, and Sumo Dandy Fuji representing the Toryuman promotion, and Mach Junji and Mohamed Yone, and a mystery partner representing Battlers. At the June 11th Seikendo show at the Yokohama Arena, they announced a match with Osamu Tashiakari, the sumo and later pro wrestler who lasted about 1 minute in January in the Pride match with Gary Goodridge, and a Russian giant who would debut that nobody has ever seen, but is being billed at 7'7" and 660 pounds. KO, the husband of former pro wrestler Mitsuko Nishiwaki, who is a new national celebrity having won the recent sumo national tournament, will be in Tashiakari's corner because KO grew up in sumo as Tashiakari's protege. MMW on May 28 at Korakuen Hall had a 3-way dance with Tetsuhiro Kuroda and Mr. Ganasuke, with the winner getting the next shot at Koto Fuyuki's Wu title. Fuyuki was heel ref and helped Ganasuke win the match. Protested, and suddenly Shoichi I wanna be Vince McMahon Arai turned into a heel owner and said that Fuyuki's decision stands, and joined by Fuyuki, Koji Nakagawa and Hideki Hasaka to feud against Gun, featuring Kuroda, Riki Fuji and Flying Kid Ichihara. It was said that Ganasuke had blown out his knee, and he does have a history of knee problems. While wrestling last week at E3 in Los Angeles, actually came to the ring walking with a cane on May 27, and started attacking woman wrestler Kaori Nakayama with it until made the save. Ganasuke will be out of action until June 21 at Korakuen Hall. Also at Korakuen Hall, Koto Fuyuki and Kyoko Inoue and Chocoball Mukai regained the Wu Trios titles from Geto Injado and Koji Nakagawa. At the May 28 show in Tokyo for Battlers, Minoru Tanaka said that he was staying with the company. Daisuke Ikeda, a longtime regular with the group, who had worked regularly with All Japan, left the company for a full-time All Japan position. Tanaka has looked great over the past year on New Japan shows, and the company has continued to bring him in for many tours. Version is running a major show on June 10 in Sapporo, with Asia Kong defending the Queen of Version belt against Gami, and Michiko Umukai and Mima Shimoda defend the Twin Stars of Version tag titles against the Hamada sisters. IWA fired Jason the Terrible after walking out in the middle of the show over some sort of a booking disagreement on May 27, and owner Kiyoshi Asano sent him home from the tour. Here and there. Lionsgate has decided against releasing Beyond the Mat to theaters in Canada, but Universal has now decided on a limited release starting June 16 in Montreal, Toronto and Vancouver, and some smaller markets. The movie did a decent first week in the US and then fell greatly, but Canada is generally a stronger market for wrestling than the US, and a far stronger market for documentaries. The home video will be out in late August. Apparently, the match Combat Zone Wrestling is working on for June 25 in Philadelphia is promoter John Zanding and Terry Funk versus Atsushi Onita and Dick Togo in a no-rope electrified barbed wire dynamite death match. Zanding and the CZW group returned for their second tour with Big Japan this past week. In one of the biggest indie crowds of this or any other year, the debut of Ron Fuller's Ronald Welch, an indie that will run every Friday night at Chilhowie Park in Knoxville, drew a crowd estimated at 2,500 for what was described as a very major league-looking show. The show was largely based around former Knoxville headliners as well as some WWF developmental talent and locals. The headbangers were brought in for the main event to put over the Rock and Roll Express on top. Bob Armstrong was positioned as the top singles babyface, and Jim Cornette was in to reprise their Smoky Mountain wrestling feud. Armstrong wrestled Jimmy Golden in the semifinal. Golden came out as Bunkhouse Buck, but Fuller told him to go to the back because he didn't book Buck but booked the wrestler Jimmy Golden. Robert Fuller, who has to be pushing 50, which I guess still makes him younger than a few of the WCW headliners, was back in the ring, but Ron didn't wrestle. Buddy Landell worked as the MC, but there were complaints he was pushing the merchandise too hard and became annoying. There was a big fracas outside the building with Terry Landell handing out flyers to his rival Tennessee Mountain Wrestling shows and causing a disturbance that was generally viewed to be a work to eventually setting up an interpromotional angle. Dirty White Boy, Mark Henry, and even the Mongolian Stomper, Archie Gouldy, now 64 years old, are scheduled for this coming week. Former Smoky Mountain wrestler Mark Killer Kyle is doing a Godfather gimmick as Big Money Marcus with his Money Honeys. Cornette did an interview saying he's returned to put Bob Armstrong out, reprising their many-year-long feud which was the cornerstone of the old SMW territory. The show was well organized and had pyro held outdoors, and fans were really into it and pushed the history of Knoxville wrestling hard. The complaints were that the matches seemed rushed, particularly toward the end of the show. The Tough Man TV show that we wrote about a few weeks back, which will pit some fringe NFL players against some fringe pro wrestlers in a team competition, takes place on June 2nd in Detroit. Ken Shamrock will be coaching the wrestlers, who are mainly from the Ultimate Pro Wrestling Camp in Southern California. Superstar Wrestling Explosion on May 27th in Green Bay, Wisconsin drew 350 for a show that included Greg Valentine, Dan Severn, Honky Tonk Man, Paul Orndorff, who looked in great shape, One Man Gang, Von Harris, Typhoon, Tatanka, Brian Knobs, Road Warrior Animal, Jim Duggan, and Public Enemy. Among the advertised no-shows were Al Snow, Viscera, Doink, Barbarian, Road Warrior Hawk, and Bushwhackers. Barbarian was in India and Bushwhackers were in England. On this past weekend's Memphis Championship Wrestling, they played up big the idea that Bobcat, the Godfather's hoe in that match a few weeks back where she pinned Crash to win the title and lost it seconds later, had won the hardcore title. Then they showed a girl, who they didn't make clear, stripping Bobcat of her gown in a bathroom scene. Pete Gas was announced as having been injured by Bull Payne and Todd Morton in Memphis at the May Barbecue Festival. Payne and Morton then double-teamed and injured Rodney, so it ended up with Joey Abs in a handicap match against both. Rodney came in with a chair and cleaned house and hit ref Alcoholic with a beer and then grabbed his hand to count 3, so Abs won. Steve Regal told the crowd that he was sick and tired of beating Reckless Youth and that he had a match upcoming with Benoit. Of course, Youth then pinned Regal clean to win the match. They had another bathroom scene with Bobcat talking with Vanity, who stripped Bobcat down to her bra and panties. The show was built around the idea that K-Crush, Ron Killings, would defend the Southern title against anyone but Jerry Lawler. So Lawler came out under the hood of Masked Man number 1, a wrestler who has been appearing on TV of late, formerly Hollywood Little. Of course, Lawler won the match and got the title. Apparently the Windy City Battle of the Belt show drew more in the range of 700 in Hammond, Indiana last week than the 2001 reported. On Power Pro, the big angle was that there would be no more assaulting of company officials. Hales claimed that Wolfie D was in jail for attacking him and had been stripped of the PPW title. Coco Ware is now General Coco Ware in military fatigues. C.B. Wyatt did an interview claiming that Don Bass, one of the original Memphis Assassins, but not the more famous Assassins, showed up saying he was both a member of the Assassins and the Kangaroos, and that he was old and out of shape but could still whip. C.B. Bass chased Wyatt to the back and came out of the back holding Wyatt's clothes. The Assassins and Wyatt, wearing a towel, jumped Bass. They ended up with Hales versus Brandon Baxter, and if Baxter won, he could pick a challenger for the PPW title. But if Baxter lost, he'd have to leave PPW. The lights went out as Hales had the match won, and when the lights came on, Hales, Baxter and the ref were all knocked out. A second ref came in and Baxter ended up covering Hales first for the win. As the storyline later played out, Baxter had bailed Wolfie out of jail and he turned out the lights. The main event was Ali versus Wolfie for the vacated title. After a ref bump, Ali used his Ali driver and the ref counted to 3. The ref acted as if he was still disoriented and then raised Wolfie's hand and gave him back the belt. I guess Wolfie and Ali look so similar, actually they couldn't look more opposite, a non-muscular white boy and a near Tony Norris-sized African American. That finish used to work in the days of Ray Stevens versus Pat Patterson or Jack Briscoe versus Don Baracco, but it's really a stretch here. Taka Michinoku is now working for the IWA in Puerto Rico as part of Club WWF along with Steve Bradley, Andy Anderson and valet Natasha. Tiger Ali Singh returned home to Canada to recover from an ankle injury. Even though WWC got an injunction to keep IWA from billing Juan Rivera Savio Vega as TNT, the fans chant TNT at him when he wrestles. They're building toward a June 16th show in Aguas Buenas, Puerto Rico with Ed Christian, Too Cool, Kurt Angle, Perry Saturn and Bob Holly headed in. Richard Kieran, 76, the father of veteran wrestler Steve Kieran, passed away on May 25. For those who grew up in Florida, while Richard Kieran may have never appeared on a Championship Wrestling from Florida TV show, and he may have once or twice but I'm not aware of it, fans from that period would know about him. He was one of only 2 men to be held as a POW in both World War II and in Vietnam. He spent 9 months in a POW camp in Germany in 1944 and spent nearly 8 years as a prisoner of war after being shot down over Hanoi from 1965 to 1973. He received more than 25 military honors during his career. During the 70s, when Kieran was a top babyface in the Florida territory, they often used foreign heels and Kieran talking about legitimate stories about his father to build up heat for matches. XPW ran its second show at the Los Angeles Sports Arena on May 27. The main event saw Sabu retain the XPW title, beating Chris Condito. After the match, Abdullah the Butcher attacked Sabu. Tracy Smothers also debuted on the undercard, beating Tony Jones. The most entertaining match was reported as being Damien and Halloween over Mosco de la Merced and El Solcero. Sabu vs. Dirt Bike Kid and Dan Severn vs. Michael Kovic headline for the Frontier Wrestling Alliance show on August 5 in Halifax, West Yorkshire, England. Becky Levi will also issue a challenge to any woman in the crowd for a shooting match. There was an article in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution over the past week about former President Jimmy Carter and that he bumped into Jesse Ventura. Carter told Ventura about how his mother was a huge wrestling fan and attended the matches regularly in Columbus, Georgia, which is a true story, and she even wrote fan letters to wrestlers. Ventura told Carter that he remembered meeting his mother when he wrestled in Columbus, Georgia. There has been a lot of conjecture about this because Ventura is not believed to have ever wrestled for Georgia Championship Wrestling or for Fred Ward in Columbus, Georgia during the period Lillian was regularly going to the matches, and there is much question among people who were regular attendees about the validity of the statement. Ventura may have wrestled in Columbus, Georgia when he worked for the WWF. Speaking of Ventura, he was scheduled for a meeting on May 30 in St. Paul with Antonio Inoki, and on May 27 came out in a Washington Post story saying that he felt he could enter the presidential race at the last minute and win the election because Bush and Gore are too bland, but his spokesman Paul Moore said he absolutely is not going to run. Some notes from Australia. The IWA is talking about bringing in Jason the Terrible, Ralph Rodriguez, and Leatherface, Rick Patterson, from Japan this summer. There was a really strange show on May 20th in Denver from a group called Central Wrestling Organization, which billed Anne-Marie Crooks, formerly Midnight in WCW, Sonny Ono, and Ernest Miller. Ono was there as a manager, but Miller wasn't there, claimed to have missed the show due to having an autograph sessions elsewhere. Ono did the salt-throwing routine, which does wonders for his case since he was playing the same character after leaving WCW that he's suing the company for the character being demeaning. Crooks was there, but never wrestled. Steve Rickard promoted several shows on a recent tour of India under the name NWA Warzone Atlantic Asia Tour, which included Marty Jannetty, Public Enemy, 911, Barbarian, and Tatanka. Don Luce, Fred Hornby, Steve Yohei, and Jim Melby just finished a Shandor Sabo record book. Sabo was one of the biggest stars in wrestling in a career from 1931 to 1963 and may have been the first top heavyweight to use suplexes. He also most of the major world titles and may have been the only wrestler in history to wear the Strangler Lewis belt, the Luthez belt, the Montreal Don Eagle belt, and the Joe Stecker belt. The book is priced at $30 at Jim Melby, 1018 Rose Avenue, St. Paul, Minnesota 55106. For those in San Jose, RF Video will be opening a wrestling shop at the Eastridge Mall in San Jose on June 15th. They have just opened at the Ontario Mills Mall in Ontario, California. Benjamin Jarrells, 60, a wrestler in the 60s out of Springfield, Ohio, passed away of natural causes at his home in Anna, Ohio. Jarrells worked in the 60s mainly doing jobs for Ed Farhat's promotion out of Detroit. MMA. Pride's June 4th lineup for Nagoya Rainbow Hall is now scheduled as Gilbert Yvel vs. Vitor Belfort, Igor Vovchankin vs. Daijiro Matsui, Carlos Barreto vs. Trey Telligman, Marcelo Tiger vs. Heath Herring, Rico Rodriguez vs. Gary Goodridge, Carlos Newton vs. pro wrestler Naoki Sano, and Joel de Oliveira vs. Matt Serra. Sano was a late replacement for stablemate Minoru Toyonaga, who was diagnosed as having a brain tumor. The next Pride show after this will be on August 27th at the 52,000-seat Seibu Dome in Tokorozawa. At this point, Ken Shamrock is scheduled to headline the show against either Mark Coleman or Kazuyuki Fujita. Pride has announced that every major fighter with a promotion would appear, and they would have fan internet balloting to give them ideas on potential matchups. Add Alex Andrade, a student of Guy Mesgers in the Dallas area, who has fought before in Pancrase, against Amaury Bitetti from Brazil. Vitetti was in one of UFC's most legendary matches in history in 1996 against Don Frye in Detroit, coming up on the losing end of a brutal beating which at the time was considered something of a huge upset in the martial arts world because this was during the period where it was thought the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu masters were very difficult to beat. K1 ran on May 28 in Sapporo with first-round matches in a Japanese-only tournament. Great Kusatsu Jr., the son of the 70s Iway wrestler, lost to Hiroki Kurosawa on the show. The card drew an 8.0 rating in a 3:30 p.m. T-slot on NTV, and a replay showing that aired the next night at 1:25 a.m. drew a 3.7. IFC signed a 4-show deal with the Tropicana in Atlantic City, and New Jersey has given basically experimental approval of the sport, reserving full approval to the aftermath of the shows. ECW. The latest on Raven is that it doesn't appear he's in a hurry to leave, at least not until August when his contract expires. Paul Heyman did say that he's giving Raven the chance to leave on a positive note if he accepts the release ECW is trying to give him, but if not, he's going to get fired rather quickly. At the TV tapings in Toledo over the weekend, Heyman had Raven laid out both by Credible and by Scotty Anton. Rob Van Dam is filming an episode of VIP starring Pamela Anderson Lee which will air in late September, playing an army major from the past who has invented all sorts of new radical weaponry. Of the newcomers on the road this past weekend, the local wrestlers like Tom Evans and Jorge Estrada were generally considered as not quite ready. Chris Hamrick, a longtime indie worker from the Carolinas, was said to be a good enough worker but with questionable marketability. CGAFI, WCW's Tony Marinara, debuted and took 2 insane bumps at the May 26 TV tapings in Toledo, Ohio, including being thrown over the top rope into the crowd and landing in the chairs, and later did a flip dive off the top rope, and his head crashed against the guardrail. Marinara impressed everyone at the WCW power plant with his bumps and as a worker, but ended up being let go because he had suffered so many concussions at such a young age. Marinara debuted as part of the FBI, only to have Guido and Sal E immediately turn on him. On that show, the Rob Van Dam vs. Balls Mahoney match went home early because Van Dam accidentally kicked Mahoney too hard in the ribs and Mahoney was in such pain he had to go right home. All the FMW wrestlers, with the exception of Kentaro Kanemura, that Paul Heyman expressed interest in having new deals with FMW. Paul Heyman was very interested in signing Masato Tanaka to a full-time deal. Tanaka ended up signing for probably less than half of what he could have gotten here, but he doesn't like the idea of spending that much time away from his home that ECW requires. The feeling is more that they were using ECW as leverage to get a better deal, as with the exception of Kanemura, none wanted to live full-time in the US. WCW. Eduardo Anibal Gonzalez, Juventud Guerrera, ended up being sentenced after a plea bargain guilty plea on May 26 to 48 hours in prison as well as community service work in exchange for a guilty plea in charges of fleeing from police and a DUI in State College, Pennsylvania. Gonzalez won't be deported, which was a significant fear until at least Thursday night. He had been injured 3 days earlier at the Thunder tapings, hurting his ribs on the landing when either he didn't fall right, was thrown wrong, or was caught wrong when pressed over the top by Van Hammer and thrown onto Conan. He's expected to be out of the ring for a few weeks, but the nature of the company today, they may ask him to work and simply not do anything. Conan was actually injured more seriously catching Guerrera, who apparently was falling out of control. At first it was believed Conan suffered a broken elbow, but an X-ray revealed no break. His arm was too swollen for an MRI, which won't take place until the swelling is down. The belief at this point is that he's got a partially torn tricep that won't require surgery, so his downtime won't be lengthy. Both were at Nitro but didn't get involved in anything physical. Tammy Sytch was taken off Nitro after an incident backstage before the show. There have been numerous reports of her being fired, which definitely wasn't the case as of press time. Before the show, 2 of the other women working in the company found syringes in a restroom adjacent to the women's locker room along with a vial of Nubane, a pain-killing drug that has in recent years become popular with some wrestlers and was a major problem in the ECW dressing room several months back, in the bathroom, and apparently it was linked to her. She was described as being in very bad shape backstage before the show, and it was said that before the show she was in the same said bathroom for an eternity. She was supposed to do a catfight spot with Miss Hancock on the show to set up a mixed tag feud with Chris and Tammy versus David and Miss Hancock, but after Bischoff and Janie Angle were alerted, she was pulled from the show, and it is believed she was ordered to take a drug test the next day. Nitro on May 29 in Salt Lake City drew 7,746 fans, which was 4,051 paying $100,363. Tony Schiavone called the number 12,000 on television. Largely due to the main event, it was a really good show. Flair returned and then the Ran-B security kidnapped Reed and Beth Flair. Nash and Scott Steiner came out as faces with Nash mentioning how Hall is getting better. Flair then came out. Nash then gave the title belt to Flair saying since Flair never lost it, he should have it. He should have mailed it fourth-class book rate with all that belt means these days. Jarrett came out and challenged Flair to a title match. Flair said he wanted the night off. Russo came out and showed David holding Reed and Beth hostage and somehow that led to Flair accepting the title match later in the show. Vampiro showed up driving a gasoline truck. Filthy Animals came out. They are doing a gimmick where Disco Inferno tries to talk cool but keeps screwing up. MIA then came out. It wound up with Lieutenant Loco, Chavo Jr., against Disco in a lumberjack match. The original plan was for Chavo to wrestle Mysterio Jr. because somehow nobody in WCW has figured out that Mysterio Jr.'s knee is more than a month away from being ready. Everyone interfered. Mysterio Jr. set up a Bronco Buster but Major Guns came out and, I'm not making this up, Ray started to undo his belt like the two of them were going to have some form of sex right there on TV. She kicked him low. Loco won with a tornado DDT in 2:48. Nitro Girl Tigress came out and attacked Guns. Apparently Tigress is now Ray's girlfriend. Tigress will now be Ray's manager. Vampiro did an interview. Chronic beat up Horace while this was going on and Palumbo and Stasiak attacked Chronic. Miss Hancock came out dancing. Condito threatened her. This was the spot where Tammy Sitch was supposed to have a confrontation with Hancock. David Flair came out to save Hancock. You see, for the 99% of the audience that doesn't know they are dating in real life, it's because they are dating in real life. Rick attacked David. All the security guys came out to get beat up and David escaped with her. They are doing an angle where Daphne is mad because she's picked out her wedding dress and pointed all this out. Kimberly arrived. Donnie Osmond and Karl Malone were in the crowd. G.I. Bro beat Awesome in an ambulance match in 2:44. These two were messing up spots right and left out there. Paige hit Awesome with a chair twice and Paige and Bro double choke slammed him off the ramp through a table and put Awesome in the ambulance. Chronic beat up Palumbo and Stasiak backstage. Hogan came to the building and there was a Goldberg sighting. Bischoff came out with Miller, Kidman, Kimberly, Tori Wilson, and Horace. They announced Horace as the ref in Hogan vs. Kidman at the pay-per-view. Hogan came out. The segment abruptly ended when they cut to Goldberg. Nash had a handicap match against Rick Steiner and Abbott. Nash didn't sell even for the 2-on-1 until Rick hit him with a wrench. Fans were cheering for Goldberg. He came out to a big pop, since it's something that has been built up for a while. He used the spear and jackhammer on Rick Steiner while Abbott bailed out. The match simply ended at 1:46. Nash and Goldberg hugged. Goldberg challenged Abbott to a match on June 5th in Atlanta at the Phillips Arena. In a sense it makes no sense to give away Goldberg's first match on free TV as opposed to the pay-per-view, but in the grand scheme of things, since nobody buys the pay-per-views, it has now come to the point where it's almost a waste to put the big matches on pay-per-view. Goldberg left in a Viper and screeched off. We're told the Goldberg-Abbott match is going to have to be kept short and simple because Goldberg's arm isn't ready yet. Funk and Vampiro had no ending in about 5:10. Guess that no schmaz finish doctrine didn't last very long. Funk was moving real slow. Vampiro used the nail in the coffin on Funk on the ramp and then did it to the ref on the ramp, which made perfect sense since nobody could count the pin. Vampiro tried to burn Funk with a pyro. He slammed Funk through some tables as they worked their way backstage to the production truck. Vampiro fell off the stairs through a table. Vampiro supposedly doused Funk with gasoline and wanted to set him on fire, but Sting made the save. Vampiro got a blowtorch to set the entire parking lot on fire, but security stopped him. They did a DDP at home segment where he got home, all his stuff had been packed and she changed the locks on the door. He showed up and the police were there and told him she'd taken out a restraining order against him. It was so funny that they had to have one cop out there putting DDP over as a big star in the segment. Back to Real Life Live. Awesome asked for Kimberly's help. She was acting like a total bitch. She ended up in the ring with Awesome and Palumbo and called out Liz. They grabbed her and Kimberly was about to throttle her until Paige came out and hit the diamond cutter on Awesome. However, he violated the restraining order because he came near Kimberly. So they cuffed him. Then Palumbo for no reason attacked the police officers with a twister. Now, even in the fake world, hacking a police officer with a twister should result in some sort of an arrest. Palumbo continued to attack Paige until Luger, with his face all bandaged, selling the deal from last week, and it took Russo a long time to convince Luger to do this angle, made the save. Awesome then attacked Page again when he was handcuffed until Malone made the save and gave Awesome the diamond cutter. The Malone run-in got a big pop and at least he's credible in doing the stuff. Scott Steiner beat Douglas in the Asylum match with a camel clutch in 2:29 to keep the US title. Kidman beat Sting in 2:25 when Vampiro hit Sting with the blowtorch. Sting did a running dive off the ramp into the ring and for what it was fairly good. Hogan cleaned house on everyone. Bischoff hit Hogan with a chair but he didn't sell it. Miller kicked Hogan with a Van Daminator-like move. Then everyone beat on Hogan, with Horace in there as well. The segment ended with them taking a Hogan red and yellow t-shirt off him and putting it in a garbage can on fire. Vampiro then tried to put Sting's face in the fire but Chronic made the save. Finally Jarrett beat Flair to regain the title in 7:55. It was actually amazing just how good this match was. David was ref. It wasn't like there were any great moves. But Rick knew exactly how and when to make comebacks and the crowd was going nuts. Rick hit David to knock him out. Charles Robinson came out as a second ref but he got bumped. Finish saw David give Jarrett the guitar and he got the pin with Russo counting the fall. Fans pelted the ring with garbage. Make no mistake about it. The people somehow cared about the belt when Flair had it, which guaranteed they had to take it off him. Thunder tapings on May 30th in Boise, ID. The show opened with worldwide matches. Elix Skipper had his name changed to Mr. Skipover, and he now dances to the ring, and he beat Mike Sanders. Gimmick was said to be pretty bad. Chronic won a 2-on-3 over Shane Eden and Air Paris and Alan Funk. Douglas beat Chris Harris. Thunder opened with a very good match with Funk beating Condito for the hardcore title. They brawled out of the building. Funk put Condito in the back of a truck and drove him to a veterinary clinic near the arena. They started fighting in the stable. Funk ended up bleeding. They wound up in the stalls and there was at least one spot where Funk had his face rubbed in manure and may have been a pile driver into the horse manure. During this segment in an unplanned spot, a horse kicked Funk in the face, which was said to have looked dangerous as hell, but he seemed fine afterwards, although by this point Funk is probably the single best actor in the world at both selling both real and non-existent pain, and in not selling very real pain, whatever the case may be needed for at that moment. Flair did an interview and challenged Russo to a match. Russo asked instead for a tag with Rick and Reed versus David and Russo. Beth and Reed were both out. Russo told Beth that he knows the only reason she stays married to Rick is for the money and after the pay-per-view when he loses his job there won't be any more money. Rick was said to be pretty good but overall this segment lasted really long and was said to be not as good as Monday. During the conclusion, a fan, who was not a plant, threw a chair over the rail. They claimed since Bischoff wasn't there, he did the taped announcement later in the show about changing the entire face of the industry, that Cat was in charge of the new blood. Kidman told Cat he doesn't trust Horace, which sets up a three-way with Sting. This wasn't on the TV, but it should be noted that earlier in the day, Luger and Elizabeth had a real-life blow-up with Russo. They refused to do whatever the angle it was that was supposed to be booked on the show, and the scheduled pay-per-view matches with Luger versus Palumbo and Elizabeth versus Kimberly are questionable, the latter one more than the former. Sting won the three-way over Horace and Kidman when Sting got his pin back on Kidman. Somehow I doubt Kidman got the shooting star in and had Sting pinned clean before the distraction and the finish like the previous night. Horace and Kidman weren't getting along in the match. Match was said to be okay, but except for this bout and Funk Condito, there was said to be nothing close to decent wrestling. They did what was described as a really bad angle where a fan attacked Kimberly and Awesome threw him through a table. The table was already set up before the fan came out. They did a two-part segment where Smiley and Ralphus, who are backfired, broke and homeless, were walking the streets looking for work and heard about kids doing backyard wrestling. As the second part of the segment ended, Smiley told the kids not to do backyard wrestling but instead learn amateur wrestling. Smiley showed the kids some amateur moves and eventually pinned the kid who was the backyard champion, and thus got his belt. So you got it. Smiley will be returning with a new title of World Backyard Champion or something of that sort. Jarrett beat Douglas in a title match when Miller interfered to help Jarrett. They did a taped DDP interview with Mike Tenay where Tenay asked DDP about all the problems, with Kimberly leaving him, Arquette turning on him and Canyon's injury and asked him if maybe the real problem was him. DDP stormed off the set. Stasiak and Palumbo won the tag titles from Chronic. It was announced before the match that the title could change on a DQ for this match only and that DQs would be called. So guess what? Chronic was DQ'd for using the twister that Palumbo had brought into the ring, and thus lost the titles. David and Russo beat Rick and Reed when Rick was KO'd by the Statue of Liberty and Reed was double-teamed and pinned. It was said to have been a huge mistake to give away lengthy segments of Rick versus David before the pay-per-view because this small taste will make people less interested in the match because it wasn't good. Flair did an interview, ripped the bandage from the previous night off his forehead and bled again, and challenged Russo to a cage match at the Atlanta Nitro. Finally, they had a match where the winner would get a title shot at Jarrett at the pay-per-view with Abbott and Rick Steiner versus Nash and Scott Steiner. Jarrett kept trying for DQ so nobody would score a pin. Every time the ref would call for a DQ, Cat would overrule the ref and order the match to continue until finally Nash pinned Rick after a powerbomb. Thunder tapings on May 23 in Saginaw, Michigan saw Daphne keep the Cruiserweight title in a three-way over Candido and Artist when Tammy accidentally hit Candido with Miss Hancock's writing tablet. Douglas told Ralphus and Smiley he could get them their jobs back and have a shot at the hardcore title. That set up a three-way with Douglas, Smiley and a guy in the gorilla suit that was supposed to be Ralphus but ended up being Funk. The gorilla hit Douglas with a chair and pinned him and then unmasked. The performance Funk, with a pillow under his gorilla suit to give him a Ralphus-sized girth, put on pretending to be Ralphus was tremendous. MIA and Filthy Animals had an elimination match that ended with Shawn Stasiak running in followed by Booker T's save as G.I. Bro. This was the match where Van Hammer dropped Juventud over the top rope onto Konnan and that wound up with both men injured. Russo, David Flair, Daphne and a woman playing the role of Reed Fleer's 6th grade teacher Miss Snodgrass. There was actually a wrestler named Elvira Snodgrass who in 1941 drew the largest crowd in history for a women's wrestling match with Mildred Burke until it was broken in 1995. She said that Reed was teaching the other kids to make fart noises with their armpits and sticking mirrors on classmates' shoes so he could look up the girls' skirts. That had to be Ric Flair's son. David challenged Reed to a match at the Bash. Nash and Scott Steiner destroyed security. Russo hid behind Flair and shoved him into Nash, who killed David with a power bomb. Russo hit behind the teacher but Nash talked him into letting her go and started choking him. Anyway, this led to the three-way match where Nash won the title. Palumbo beat Wall in a tables match. Horace Hogan and Kidman beat Chronic. Kidman got zero offense. Horace beat Adams after a weak chair shot. Chronic came out with the belts, lost. But Kidman and Horace are not the champs. It wasn't made clear until after the fact that it was a non-title match, although I'm still not clear when Chronic ever beat Douglas and Bagwell to win the titles in the first place. Maybe they lost them in a card game. Maybe Jim Duggan can find Joe C. in a garbage can and become the new World Midget Champion. Douglas dragged out Ralphus and started pounding on him until Wall made the save and put Douglas through a table. Ralphus was so hilarious with Jericho and is an absolute waste of time now. G.I. Bro beat Stasiak. DDP was doing an interview and Liz dragged out Kimberly and DDP spanked her. The cameras focused on the people at ringside so no spankings allowed on the show. This segment ended with Awesome in Canyon's hospital room and then turning off the cameras telling everyone to leave what happened next to their imagination. It couldn't have been that serious being that for 2 hours on Nitro the next week, it was never acknowledged. Finally Nash won the title in the three-way with Jarrett and Scott Steiner. Steiner brawled with his brother and Abbott when they tried to kidnap one of the women. Security surrounded the ring keeping any refs from getting to the ring to count. Finish saw Scott run interference for Mickey J running through all the security guards 2 by 2 and Jay hitting the ring to count 3 as Nash powerbombed Jarrett. The tabloid The Globe ran a story about the spring breakout wet t-shirt contest where Buff Bagwell took bikini tops and bottoms off some of the contestants. As mentioned here, the week it happened in late March, WCW officials were scared to death this would eventually make national publicity because they were aware fans had video cameras at the event. No police charges were filed because none of the women filed them. South Padre Island Mayor Ed Siganuix was quoted as saying steps need to be taken to ensure something like that never happens again. The famous Wax Museum at Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco is adding wax figures of Diamond Dallas Page and Bret Hart. The two also taped Donnie and Marie this past week for airing in the summer. Dory Funk was scheduled to be at the Terry Funk Angle on the May 22 Nitro. He was teaching his wrestling students in the morning and flew to Atlanta to catch a flight to Michigan, and the second flight was canceled and there was no other way to make it. 4 of his students are getting tryouts over the next week. Josh Wilcox, who worked ECW a little and played last season with the New Orleans Saints, Jack Moreno and Fred Curry, 3, grandson of legendary Bull Curry, are to be trying out for Terry Taylor at the power plant, while Chris Raber, who wrestles out of Austria as Chris the Bambi Killer, may get a tryout before a live audience at the June 5 Nitro. Lance Storm was in Nitro in full gear doing some promotional work but didn't appear on the show. Disco and Canyon are working backstage as road agents. Gene Okerlund has been taken off Nitro and they are going to use Pam Paulshock as the regular interviewer. Okerlund will remain on Thunder. At the Brian Pillman show, a major topic of conversation seemed to be the interview Vince Russo did on WCW Live on May 24th. The general feeling among those in the WWF were that Russo has exposed just how little he really meant to the overall success of the WWF and how little he knows about or understands about wrestling. A few WCW people were asked about his comments on the show and the reaction was that Russo is very smart and he's working the internet to get over as a heel and means nothing that he said on that show. The latter would make sense as an explanation, but there's still one nagging problem. His writing style and all the recent television reflects a belief in everything he said on that show. The biggest joke are the statements that don't hold up to even the most basic analysis of today's business, such as all the world title changes being good for business or the title meaning nothing based on the buy rates for the last several WWF pay-per-view shows, not to mention how little any angle means to WCW house show and buy rates today because of the nature that the booking makes everything meaningless and thus, tickets aren't sold and nobody buys pay-per-view events, or that more people want to see Rock do an interview than see him wrestle, as the ratings clearly show. They want to see him on television do an interview to build up a wrestling match or physical confrontation later in the show, but far more people tune in to see the match than the interview. The Chronic 419 t-shirts are because they aren't allowed to do 420 t-shirts, because it's a pot-smoking reference, although the shirt says "got a minute" on it as well. In the UK, they are doing no language editing of Nitro, so the nothing finer than doing the 69er with Scott Steiner line did air intact. They still edit Thunder heavily. Thunder tapings on May 23 in Saginaw, Michigan drew 3,462 in the building, which was 2,341, paying $50,995. WWF. From SmackDown, it appears they are going with a four-way with Triple H vs. Rock vs. Undertaker vs. Kane for the belt as the King of the Ring main event. Raw on May 29 in Vancouver, BC drew a sellout 14,530, paying $514,360. The show opened with a big conference. The new Undertaker, the American Badass, was cutting a promo when the whole McMahon/Helmsley regime came to ringside. Triple H first kissed his ass, but Taker said he was always only out for himself and told Triple H the belt was his. After the talking was over, they surrounded the ring to attack, but Rock saved the day. Vince then set up Rock vs. Undertaker. Brown and Terry and Saturn beat Godfather and Malenko and Cat in 332 when Saturn pinned Malenko with an elbow off the top. Cat now has a red wig. I didn't think it was even possible, but she was looking bad. Edge and Christian were backstage and saw Joe C., the MIDI rapper for Kid Rock, and thought he was Mimi. Now that was funny. By the end of the show, I was hoping they would stuff that guy in a garbage can, which, in fact, they did. Guerrero beat Angle with a flying Hurricane Rana off the top in 327 to keep the European strap. Great bout while it lasted. Chyna gave Angle a low blow to set up the pin. A mystery man who at the end of the show apparently was supposed to be Kane attacked and laid out Road Dogg. Too Cool won the tag titles from Edge and Christian in 332 when Grandmaster Sexay pinned Christian after hitting him with the title belt after Joe C. gave him a low blow with a hockey stick. 2 straight matches with the same basic setup finish. Match wasn't as good as you'd think as Scotty and Edge blew a spot and there were a lot of timing problems. Joe C. came out with Rikishi. After the match, all 4 danced. It was annoying as hell. There's nothing worse on wrestling than a third-rate celebrity being put on the show and having the wrestlers mark out for them like they are a big star. Vince and Stephanie were eating salad. Somebody pushed the rewind button exposing that this was a pre-tape. The lights went out, Stephanie screamed and somebody laid out Vince. Rikishi beat Shane McMahon via DQ in 237 in a European title qualifier. Triple H came out. Shane used a chair for the DQ and after the bout Triple H and Shane gave Rikishi a double-team pedigree on a chair. Venus and Tanda beat Jericho and Hardys in 324 when Test pinned Matt after Albert gave Matt the neck-hanging tree slam. Just before the finish, Trish hit Jeff with her boot to knock him off the top rope. Bob Holly beat Benoit via DQ in 418. This match was stiff as hell. Benoit was a total face in Vancouver. Holly made sure of it in his pre-match interview. Fans were chanting US sucks. Actually, if these two were fighting a real fight they wouldn't even be this stiff. Fans were really into the match. It was real good ending when Jericho hit Bob with a chair for the DQ. Benoit was mad at Jericho for costing him the match. Benoit hit Holly with a chair and all 3 brawled to the back. Buchanan beat Blackman in a core qualifier with a scissors kick in 321. Dead match. Patterson got attacked by the mystery man as he was bringing everyone their coffee. Edge and Christian put Josie in a garbage can and beat the garbage can up unmercifully. Undertaker vs. Rock with all heel lumberjacks ended with them fighting all the heels. This came off like a summer rerun. Finally the heels got the advantage and Kane made the save and choke slammed Triple H. Anyone know what happened to Paul Bearer? SmackDown tapings on May 30th in Tacoma, Washington. Show was said to have not had great heat but still a lot of good wrestling. Legend and Vic beat Dupes. Crowd chanted boring during this one. For heat, Benoit pinned Rikishi with a German suplex, holding the bridge. Dudley's beat Bossman and Buchanan in a tables match. Fans were into the tables but match wasn't good. China beat Godfather in a core qualifier when Guerrero interfered. Saturn pinned Rios with an elbow off the top. Said to be sloppy early but a good finish. Venus, now managed by Stratus, beat Snow in a real good match. SmackDown started with two Cool NC Hardys when Kane came out and choke-slammed everyone. Kane still had the WWF title belt. Triple H came out and asked him for his belt back. Kane said he'd give it back if he could get a title shot. Triple H promised him a title shot if he first beat him in a non-title match on that show. Vince and DX arrived and Undertaker came out on his bike. Taker asked for a title shot at Triple H. Vince said no, unless Taker can beat both X-Pac and Road Dogg in a handicap match. Triple H and Vince met up and argued with each other since each had promised another a title shot. You can already see where this is headed. Shane, Edge and Christian and Rock met up. Shane promised Edge and Christian a tag title shot if they could beat Rock in a handicap match. But if Rock won, he'd be the #1 contender for the singles title. Triple H and Vince then both yelled at Shane since they'd already made deals for #1 contenders. Angle did an interview saying he'd win King of the Ring. Angle pinned Bradshaw clean in a core qualifier but after the match Bradshaw got right up and cleaned his clock. Benoit beat Brown with a crossface in a good match. Terry beat Kat in an arm wrestling match by squirting water in her face. Kat made a comeback and used a Bronco Buster on Terry. Lawler pulled Kat off, then laid in the corner and asked Kat to give him a Bronco Buster. But she didn't. Undertaker beat Dogg and X-Pac with a choke slam on X-Pac. Dudley's came out to keep DX from running away. After the match, Taker also choke slammed D. Von Dudley. Jericho pinned Bob Holly with a lion salt after Holly crashed into a chair Benoit had set up on the side of the ring. A few missed spots. Rock beat Edge and Christian. They did a false finish where Shane hit Rock with a chair but Rock kicked out of the pin. Main event saw Kane pin Triple H after a choke slam. There were 5 flashers in the crowd who were kicked out for those keeping score. Jericho's arm brace and Benoit's knee brace are both works to sell injuries from the pay-per-view and the SmackDown before the pay-per-view respectively. Actually by this point they've ditched them anyway. WWF Aggression fell to number 69 on the charts this past week having sold 20,708 units. The May 28 Edmonton Journal had what was actually a great article on pro wrestling by Karen Unland, who described herself as a wrestling widow. It was really interesting to read her various takes on pro wrestling, which she didn't like, but seemed to understand better than probably the majority of wrestling fans, although the Marks vs. Smart simplification as wrestling fans was terribly superficial. The idea was that Marks love wrestling unconditionally and Smarts analyze it deeper and like some and don't like other things. The reality is that the audience and popularity for wrestling varies greatly, with the vast majority of the audience being casual fans who are into whatever is hot in entertainment that don't come close to fitting into either category and really only like it or ignore it because their peer group thinks it's the in thing to do at the time. The UK-only pay-per-view in December in Sheffield, England is already sold out. The daughter of Andre the Giant, who he largely ignored in life and never spoke of and always attempted to deny was his, is writing a book about him along with her mother. The June/July issue of Talk magazine has a very good article on China by Mark Kriegel, who has done some major newspaper articles about various wrestlers over the past few years. This is the story they plugged on WWF TV last week. She talked about her childhood, saying her mother was a nutbag and father was an alcoholic who claimed to be a doctor, sometimes calling himself Dr. Von Lauer. Her father painted her as someone who was prone to living in a fantasy world, so you can see it wasn't the healthiest upbringing. She said growing up none of the guys liked her. It is amazing how many people in wrestling superstardom claim to have never had dates in high school. Actually, I believe her story and Mick Foley's, but nobody else's version of the same story. She got into weights and met a guy, spent her senior year of high school as a United Nations scholarship winner in Madrid, Spain because of her fluency in many different languages. She graduated from the University of Tampa and then started getting sued to pay back of student loans she claimed she never took out. Her father, You know Dr. Von Lauer, which sounds more impressive I guess than Joseph Lauer, claimed he was an investment banker for the Van Lauer Group, worked also as a landscaper and bookkeeper to pay her way through college and even did her homework at times. He claimed he has no idea where China's claims of him as a debtor and con man came from and that it's going to be psychologically devastating for her later on. She was waiting tables in Key Largo when she moved to New Hampshire to work for her sister, and started training for fitness pageants, meeting a bodybuilder who became her boyfriend, and she went from 155 to 185. While the story itself was well done and she's got an interesting story, the insistence in the story about her never using steroids to build her physique would certainly make many people familiar with bodybuilding skeptical of the rest of the story. She started training under Killer Kowalski. While Triple H also trained under Kowalski, the truth was that they never trained there at the same time. They actually met at a bar, Shawn Michaels and Triple H, while Lauer was trying to get someone from the WWF to take a look at her. At that meeting, Michaels made the suggestion for her to be Triple H's bodyguard. In those days, everyone thought Triple H had tremendous potential because he was tall and had a good look, but people were at wits' ends going through one gimmick after another which saw him not really get over. She got the job and then dumped her boyfriend, which she said she now feels guilty about. The article said that's not to say she wouldn't do it again because he was happy running a gym and she wouldn't be happy unless she was famous and didn't care what it would take to do so. She said the new enormous breast look came when her first set of C-cup implants didn't look right because she felt due to her shoulders she wasn't proportionate. She broke an implant during a match and got new larger models put in. She said she's always told women about not having to be a stereotypical beauty. And then she said implants and jaw surgery, with Kriegel writing that occasional hypocrisy is to be expected since she's a star. When talking about her relationship with Paul Levesque, Triple H, she said she'd like to marry him but she doesn't think the feeling is mutual, and said she wants to be a mother. Some notes from the Raw tapings in Vancouver. Nothing special as it regarded dark matches. There were many we want Brett chants. Some of the biggest pops during the TV show, which appeared to be for wrestling matches, were actually because during the show at various times roughly 8 different women took their tops off. That is why it seemed like there was great crowd reaction during the Blackman vs. Buchanan match. Rock and Undertaker did a poontang pie shtick together after the show went off the air. Former FMW wrestler Dr. Luther worked as a jobber for Joe E. Legend in a dark match under real name Len St. Clair. Tim Flowers was scheduled to work with Gangrel but it was scrapped because one of the earlier dark matches ran long. Off the Record is supposed to have an interview taped with Rock on June 4th and probably would air very shortly thereafter. Todd Pettingill, on his New York radio show last week, said he would be returning to the WWF to host Livewire. Pettingill replaced the older Gene Okerlund as a WWF interviewer in the mid-90s to give the broadcasts what were considered a more youthful appearance, but eventually he drew a lot of resentment because he was a successful DJ outside of wrestling and was able to command a high salary during a time period when the company was losing money and it wasn't like now where they can afford to throw money around with no consequence. SmackDown tapings on May 23 in Evansville, Indiana drew a sellout 6,398 paying $201,795. May 27 in Calgary drew 11,652 paying $418,625. May 28 in Edmonton drew 12,880 paying $467,820. Merchandise for the week was $315,723 American, which is $6.95 per head. The lower figure than the previous week is because of the shows being in Canada and they lose a lot on the exchange rate and we figure it as American dollars in the merchandising. At the Edmonton show, there was a lot of good wrestling, in particular Malenko vs. Crash, Tanda vs. Too Cool. The main event, Rock and Dudley's vs. Triple H and Road Dogg and X-Pac, which they put on midway into the show, Saturn vs. Guerrero, Edge and Christian vs. Hardys, and the final match which was Benoit vs. Jericho. Since Benoit is from Edmonton and it was figured there was nothing they could do to make him a heel there, Jericho came out immediately and cut a tremendous heel promo, basically saying how Calgary was the greatest city in Alberta and his favorite city to wrestle in, and went on for minutes about how much Calgary was better than Edmonton. Benoit came out wearing an Edmonton Oilers jersey for the cheap babyface hat. Benoit got the clean win to end the show. The night before in Calgary they did the opposite, with Jericho saying that he lived in Calgary for 8 years and Benoit talks about Edmonton being the city of champions. On the Calgary show, Davey Boy Smith wrestled and beat Steve Blackman. Bulldog hasn't worked many house shows. The idea was to have Stu Hart walk Davey to the ring for PR purposes. As it turned out, this didn't happen, and if you've been paying attention, you probably know both the motivation for them wanting him to do so and the reason why it didn't happen as well. Smith looked bad in Calgary in the match, and when he showed up in Edmonton, He was pulled from the show and his match with Blackman was cancelled, and he also didn't work television in Vancouver. The reality is that if it wasn't for the lawsuit, I don't think there is any way he'd be on the active roster at this point. The reader's pages. Drug testing. Pro wrestling is an art form. A good analogy is ballet, a commercial activity based on athletic performance. If that premise is accepted, it is possible that courts would strike down state regulation of pro wrestling as an unconstitutional infringement upon freedom of expression. Bobby Baum. Response from Dave Meltzer: pro wrestling is pro wrestling. Parts of it are analogous to aspect of sports and aspect of entertainment, but it is nothing in its whole form like anything else except possibly very closely in intent and form, but not at all in execution like roller derby. There are strong arguments both for and against wrestling being regulated, and states currently are split in how they handle it. If there is to be outside regulation, based on the realities of the business, to not have some form of regulation of participation based on having a full heart and brain evaluation to determine damage, as well as some form of bylaws regarding drug usage, is in this day and age negligent. Over this past week, I saw a Pro Football Insider trade publication that listed every death of every player who had ever played in the NFL during the year 1999. That was not among active players. That was among players who had ever played on an NFL roster. Most of the deaths were to people who were very old. And those in football talk about how the death rate of football players, usually a higher than the general population number of deaths in their 50s, is too high. Only 3 of the deaths were to people who had not reached 40 years of age, and everyone knows the outcry when an active player in the NFL passes away, and they are almost never due in recent years to medical neglect or long histories of ignored drug problems. There have been cases of those in football's past and very rare occasions over the past 20 years. This covers more than 10,000 players who had played in the NFL regular or preseason games over the past 17 seasons. Pro wrestling, as far as real participants, forgetting indie guys that shouldn't count, and you already know the number under 40 that passed away last year, and we are at the same rate this year. Jeff Warner. I've been thinking about your Jeff Warner piece for quite a while. If I was to write what exactly went down, do I become labeled a crybaby? Yet I want to keep credibility with you, so I owe it to you and myself to let you know what the article didn't. George Doman is a fearless Pulitzer Prize-winning author who is a bulldog of a reporter. He dug up some tough stuff. But he is young and a total mark for the boxing business. I'm not. I've written for national publications, managed world-class fighters, and made a fool of myself trying to fight a Chinese champion, and have coached and promoted for more than 20 years. As a former dope fiend and gangbanger, I've often used boxing as a tool to help get kids into a better life. Warner fooled me, and I should have known better. We got into this as a lark. We thought it would be fun to have somebody box and wrestle on the same show. Warner pulled it off, and we had sellout crowds at both events. Harry Baptiste was homeless. He was also 6'2", 255 pounds, and by all accounts a black belt in karate. His references checked out, and it was a real fight. What the article also failed to mention was that in the semi-final on that same show, another homeless man, Walter Cavners, knocked out Frankie Newton in the 6th round. Both fighters were set up to be real. The Minnesota Commission is tough and has a low tolerance for nonsense. Baptiste had worked all day on a construction site and was certainly in no condition to beat a 280-pound gassed-up genetic freak. I wasn't at the show. I promoted a wrestling show that night. Baptiste later told me he figured he was going to get $400 whether he went 20 seconds or 4 rounds, so he bailed out as quickly as he could. He was paid $400, not $50 as the article inferred, and it was enough for him to get an apartment. I didn't take a cut of Warner or Baptiste, even though Warner had given me a 10% personal services contract. I got Warner a tryout with both the American Gladiators and the Minnesota Vikings. He was an amazing physical specimen. He could kick field goals from the 50-yard line and bench 500. He nixed the Gladiator deal. He refused to be in Los Angeles for 8 to 12 weeks. He tried out for the Vikings but refused to go to camp because he wasn't given a guaranteed deal. The same with the Twins. He wanted to start in the big leagues and wasn't willing to go to Class A ball. At this point I realized I had a head case on my hands, but I also wanted to help him. He grew up poorer than poor, cared for a sickly mother, and couldn't read or write. He signed with WCW when Ole Anderson was in charge. Being a promoter of more than 50 to 100 of his matches, I can say had more than just the look. He was Bruce Hart's dream. A powerful steroid geek with great balance and an ability to do aerial work. Yes, he was green, but eventually he learned how to work a decent match. To the best of my knowledge, he had 2 runs with WCW which amounted to about 1 year in total. He also had 3 or 4 months in the WWF where he often put over Rick Martel. Whenever Kerry Von Erich would no-show, Jeff would get his spot. He showed me his first week WWF check for $3,000. By his account, his big mouth and need to be over got him fired. He said that Vince told him Hogan was washed up and he deserved a run. He got a run out the door. At this point Warner got married and told the world he was a Christian. He wanted to start on top. He wanted a match with Minnesota heavyweight champion John Sargent. Promoter Ron Peterson told Warner if he beat journeyman Bill Corrigan, who Ricky Rice once beat but later became a solid journeyman who fought against several world title holders. I refused to work with him on the fight. Boxing, like any sport, would take 1 or 2 years to learn for even a genetic freak. Warner knocked Corrigan down twice in a fight. Folks at Bob Arum's Top Rank office still watch regularly. Corrigan got up and Warner walked into a short right hand that made him a giant killer, but at 6'4", 250 himself, he was no midget. In 1993, Warner wanted to box again. His wife begged me to guide his career. They cried and prayed to God that they made the right choice. I'd be lying if I didn't admit I was taken by all of this. I agreed to manage his career only if I'd have 100% say on his opponents and trainers. He had raw talent and I knew if he followed the plan, he'd be okay and make at least a few six-figure paydays. My contacts with Don King and Ali assured me they'd help him if he fought the right foes and got a few good wins over proven vets. I brought in Jim Beattie as a trainer. Beattie roomed with Ali and wasn't owned by the mob. Jeff was off and running. He met Mike Kovar, an investment broker, through his church. He conned Kovar into giving him a large salary and bonuses per win. Thus Warner refused to take any chances in the ring. He dug up most of his own opponents and Beattie was axed. I was turned into a glorified water boy and Warner made big money just to train. He did fight Baptiste a second time on a wrestling card on an Indian reservation. At that time, the rules were such that the commissions couldn't sanction matches on a reservation but had to accept the fights as legit for records. Warner's first fight was at the Red Lake Reservation and Harry fought under the name Akbar Muhammad. Warner wanted to make an impression in front of his trusting manager. I tried to warn Kovar about him but they were in this for God and I couldn't win. Kovar did retain me as a consultant for $500 per month, so I was no longer working for Warner. I knew Warner was scamming and would sell me out. I tried to help Kovar but he was blinded. Anyway, for that fight Warner wanted a 10-second knockout win, a trick he later perfected so well against other wrestlers that ringside doctors actually feared he had inflicted serious damage to his quivering, lifeless opponents. I wanted to put on a show for Kovar and told Harry go to a few rounds. He exposed Jeff as being unable to corner him and danced for 3 rounds before taking the powder. Kovar didn't get any of this. Harry was paid $350 plus meal money, not $50. As for the Terry Taylor match, I had nothing to do with that one. I got out of the mess and warned Kovar as his consultant. Warner fought Marvin Smith, who used the name Terry Taylor. He was not homeless and earned $400. He was actually a decent club fighter and may have been able to beat Jeff legit. Warner had excuses like it's not necessary for the investors to travel to shithole towns far away, and sorry, the video camera broke, and played his games. When the contract expired, Kovar washed his hands clean and was never heard from again. I never talked to Warner as an ally again. I did get Warner 3 real fights while he was working for Kovar. A match with John Smith, which was the guy's real name, and Mike Pena. Smith was a black bodybuilder from Chicago who scared Warner shitless. He overheard Warner talking to me in the con trying to get out of the fight. Kovar was in the crowd. Wisely, Warner cut a deal of his own with Smith. He promised him money to lose. I had nothing to do with it. The Pena fight was fun. Pena had a record of 6-3. He won more than 50 Golden Gloves fights. He was 260 pounds. A win over a Pena caliber guy meant Kovar may have a solid investment on his hands. Warner tried getting to Pena. Being a legit fighter, he laughed and tried harder. Knowing Warner didn't have a prayer, I talked to the ref earlier. I told him the old Angelo Dundee trick, that Pena was sick, needed Christmas money and took the fight on short notice and I was concerned Warner could hurt him. Pena won the first 2 rounds easily but was tiring. In the 3rd round Warner hit him with a right hand and the ref jumped in too quickly to save Pena. Warner refused all attempts at a rematch. The Harold Johnson fight was real. Unfair, but real. He was a 200-pounder with no experience whose uncle was a body hauler, provides losers for boxing matches for a fee. Harold got lucky in his previous local fight when he got a KO when his opponent broke his ankle in the match. A win over Johnson meant a little. He wasn't big enough to take the blows and was as green as Warner. I knew this was real. Being a longtime associate of his uncle, I asked Harold if he was there to lose, and he told me he wasn't. I told him if he won, I'd give him my $500 monthly check. It was important to me to protect the investor. Warner bum rushed him, and with the size difference, the ref stopped it in about 1 minute. I never once called Fight Fix with the results of a Warner fight. I've way too much respect for the sport of boxing. Yes, some fights were works, especially on the local level. Others are setups, where fights are put on to favor a local fighter. Very few have taken boxing to Warner proportions. Most who did could actually fight. As for Jerry Cooney, his investors did market him as a white hope that he could actually fight. You can't win the New York Golden Gloves by being a nobody. But he choked in his big money fights. Every good prospect takes a few soft touches, but Warner flat out refused to take real fights. He was offered a deal against a Don King journeyman of our choice for $7,000. Even a loss by decision, if he looked good, would have led to a $20,000 fight against Francis Botha, who Ricky Rice, with no boxing training, once did a job for but said he thought he could have beaten him. A victory over Botha would lead to a $700,000 fight against Lennox Lewis. He flat out refused and convinced his investors he could earn billions, not millions. Something obviously happened to Warner after Corrigan drilled him. He never after that seemed to have any heart or desire to box. He refused to even spar against credible boxes. He even said several times, "Why fight? I get paid anyway." When I told him Kovar would eventually smarten up, he laughed and said he'd find others. Corrigan and I were both marks for this phenomenally talented bullshitter. Corrigan nearly lost his family and his life over it, as he suffered 2 heart attacks. I nearly lost my sanity. In the end, we looked like 2 idiots. My crime was believing in Warner. Ray Webb Jr. St. Paul, Minnesota. Pay-per-view. I was wondering if any of the major wrestling companies are concerned at all about the pirating of cable and the related effect on pay-per-view revenue. As a longtime Observer reader, I always find the buy rate figures, or lack of buy rate when it comes to WCW, to be very interesting. Recently I've noticed that everyone, and I mean everyone, has an illegal cable box. Some folks have multiple descramblers, one for each room in their house. I'm a CPA, and as a businessman, I know that the lost revenue can be significant. As a consumer, I worry about the escalating price of pay-per-view programming. Maybe I'm being idealistic, but it would seem to make sense that if everyone were paying for pay-per-view, there would be more pressure on the major companies to be competitive on their pricing. Currently, I don't have an illegal descrambling device. I also can't afford weekly pay-per-view shows. With the proliferation of these weekly pay-per-view shows, I find myself listening to the audio while watching the scrambled signal for the final hour of each event. As a side note, Jim Ross does a terrific job of describing the action in the ring. Tony Schiavone is atrocious and Joey Styles is becoming increasingly mundane. Name withheld by request. WCW. I thought you'd like some of my commentary on the latest interview with Vince Russo. The points that stood out like a sore thumb were these. 1. The fact that Vampiro never beat Sting won't affect his upward perception. Russo stated that I don't think anyone notices the losses. My opinion, if Vampiro continues to lose every match to Sting, the only reputation he's going to get is a jobber to the stars. 2. He bashes internet fans and asks questions whether certain people are on the WWF payroll. My opinion, tell the truth. He knows who is and isn't on the WWF payroll. If Nitro seems to suck and if it looks like it sucks and everyone says it sucks, then guess what? Nitro sucks. 3. Russo states the reality is every Monday or every Wednesday a title could change hands. The days of a guy having a title for 6 months to make it mean something is absolutely ridiculous. Those are the old laws of wrestling that just don't make sense in the year 2000. A champion defends his title a dozen times of TV and house shows. For him not to lose one of those dozen times is ridiculous. My opinion, what the hell is he saying? The fact that Triple H held the title for several months made it important enough that it was a big issue to see if Rock could win it. The WCW title has changed hands almost as many times as the WWF Hardcore title, which is booked to be a parody of a title on purpose. Russo and WCW don't seem to understand that any belt that changes hands on nearly every show will mean fans won't care about any of the changes because they don't care about the titles. Jeff Jarrett will never be seen by anyone as a real world champion because the belt has no credibility. 4. Russo stated that he'd watch Norman and Ralphus any day before he'd ever watch a 20-minute cruiserweight match. My opinion, that quote speaks for itself. So what's the next big surprise to take WCW to the next level? Maybe getting rid of all the crappy old-timers and starting to have some quality wrestling on the show? I know that's a mind-blowing idea. Richard Poston. I've finally figured it out. The way to rebuild WCW is not what they are doing right now, which is apparently trying to put the old guys against the new guys in a feud. The result should be the new blood going over. Well, this philosophy isn't working. When you put the old guys against the new guys, all you get as a result are bad matches and bad finishes. I never thought I'd say this, but they simply need to get rid of every old wrestler who can't work a decent match, which is basically everyone except Ric Flair, Sting, and Diamond Dallas Page. This is what has to happen if WCW really wants to rebuild. But of course it won't. J.P. Coleman. Who are the real marks? After watching the past 3 weeks of Nitro, I'm beginning to wonder. I think it is the members of the New Blood organization who actually believe that the Millionaires Club would actually put them over. After watching Hogan and Nash week after week destroy Awesome, Kidman, Conan, Ray Jr. and others, I think it's pretty obvious. It's too bad. I was looking forward to the new combinations and the elevation of the younger wrestlers. We are just getting squash matches where the jobbers are sometimes given mic time. The more things change, the more they remain the same. Grant Swarich. Just when I thought there wasn't any possible way I could think less of WCW, they unceremoniously fire a loyal, dedicated employee who gave 15 years of quality service. Since he didn't get a decent send-off, I feel compelled to give him what he deserves. It seems like only yesterday, back in 1977, that a pimple-faced, greasy-haired teenager named Bobby Eaton started his career in Alabama and Tennessee. He was a raw talent to begin with. He quickly developed into a decent worker with some impressive aerial moves. In a short time, he moved to the main events, working with the likes of Tojo Yamamoto, Dennis Condrey and a pre-steroided-up Randy Savage. I remember a night when Eaton teamed with Andre the Giant to face two cocky teenagers named Michael Hayes and Terry Gordy. Eaton was later given the impossible task of teaming with George Gulas. Maybe working for Nick Gulas prepared him for what would come at the end of his career. There was one major drawback I thought would keep Eaton from working for one of the top companies. His interviews were awful. Whenever he was in front of the camera, he was like a deer in the headlights. Thank God for Jim Cornette, otherwise Eaton would have spent his entire career working for Gulas-type promoters or being a talented jobber. You can imagine my surprise and joy when I first saw Eaton on TBS in 1985 with Dennis Condrey, another bad promo guy. I had no idea Eaton would stay with the company until the turn of the century. I just wanted everyone to know how hard this man worked to get to where he got, and I wish him the best. You said in the newsletter that the poor advance here in Birmingham for the ECW show was because so many people got free tickets for the pay-per-view show. I think I've got a better reason for the poor advance. No publicity. Jim Ward. Birmingham, Alabama. I've noticed something regarding the announcing of Jim Ross. On many occasions, when there is something involving Pat Patterson, he makes comments like, "Hey fellas, he's single," or he likes to bring in the rear. Most times they don't seem to be said with a lot of humor attached to them. Is there legitimate heat between them, or is Patterson in on the joke? With all the talk about whether the XFL will succeed or fail, one thing has yet to have been discussed in detail. Vince McMahon has franchises in the Northeast and the Midwest. He better pray for a mild winter. How many people will come out to be a brand new football league in near zero temperatures or blizzard-like conditions? Those that do are probably the same type that would throw snowballs at the players. The weather alone could doom the league. We've been lucky in the Northeast that the last 4 winters haven't been that bad, but it can't last forever. John Quinn. New York, New York. Response from Dave Meltzer: they are meant as an inside rib which practically every WWF announcer dating back to Gorilla Monsoon, Vince McMahon and Jesse Ventura have done regarding Patterson in the past. Russo. You ought to check out the Vince Russo interview on WrestleLine. It's very interesting and incredibly convoluted. In case you don't have time, here's a couple of the highlights. He says that Vince McMahon is rattled and angry and he likes McMahon being in that mode. He said McMahon knows Bischoff and Russo are back and a threat to him. He uses this to explain McMahon's partnership with ECW and to explain why Mick Foley was brought back at WrestleMania. Of course, there is no way Russo doesn't know that Foley was brought back for Mania before Russo and Bischoff were put back in power. He claimed that Mike Awesome never had an ECW contract and that Awesome came to WCW first, completely ignoring the fact that WCW paid 6 figures to buy him out of his ECW contract that WCW has admitted existed. This one is my favorite. He said he is now a performer because he cares so much about WCW. He said he wouldn't have been a performer before, but his being a performer has nothing to do with ego. It's that he's willing to put his body on the line in angles because he cares about WCW succeeding so much. Like he's a colossal ratings draw that everyone was dying to see on TV and is going to be a big help to WCW. He still asserts that the ratings consistently went up during his initial reign and he was brought down solely by politics. He talked about a 2.6 before he entered and a 3.4 his last week. Of course, your analysis in The Observer shows how ridiculous that claim is. His explanation for not putting any foreign talent on television since he came back, as Sonny Ono has claimed, is this: Silver King and Dandy have no talent. He's never seen the Young Dragons. He responded by Ono's discrimination case by saying that he's pushed Norman Smiley, Booker T and Ernest Miller. He said the reason he doesn't push any foreign talent is that in order to relate to the American audience, you need to wrestle and be an entertainer, and it's difficult to entertain and relate to the audience if you can't speak English. Todd Martin. Vince Russo has said in a couple of recent interviews that he defies anyone to come up with anything creative the WWF has done since he left, other than the marriage of Triple H and Stephanie McMahon. I agree with your opinion that good booking doesn't necessarily have to be all that creative, but I thought about what he said anyway and came up with a short list of creative things the WWF has done. Keep in mind, I'm not saying these were all great ideas, they were just all creative ideas. 1. Edge and Christian's new heel gimmick and their ringside commentary about doing run-ins. 2. Getting the Dudleys over as babyfaces by putting women through tables. 3. Coming up with the Rikishi gimmick and putting him with Too Cool and having them dance together. 4. Putting the 24/7 rule in effect for the hardcore title. I'm not a fan of the gimmick, but there have been funny moments like when they had Jonathan Ogden and Benny Thompson of the Baltimore Ravens try to pin him. 5. Developing the Kurt Angle character. 6. The Big Show's new personality. 7. Playing to Steve Blackman's weakness by creating the head cheese gimmick. 8. The Acolyte Protection Agency gimmick. 9. Having the heel go over at WrestleMania and making Triple H a credible champion and main event heel. 10. Having matches with good work rate and decisive finishes. Now this creativity may not rank with Russo's genius, like the Piñata on a pole match, the Oklahoma gimmick or Chavo Guerrero's Amway salesman gimmick, but it's creativity nonetheless. Mike Wisniewski. Let me add my thoughts regarding the new WCW regime. I think Vince Russo and Eric Bischoff are so intent on being creative and swerving the small minority of fans who think they know the behind-the-scenes reality of wrestling that they miss the main point, which is that most fans really only care about personality and seeing the guys overcome adversity to achieve their goals. Fans need to identify with the characters and feel like there is some purpose. By WCW treating the title belt as a prop, one of the clearest goals is destroyed. If the NFL decided there would be no Super Bowl and they would instead randomly select a champion each year, how many fans would lose interest in watching the entire season when there is no end result to shoot for? It is the quest that fans love. Treating the belt as something trivial or useless because not doing so is traditional is short-sighted. In WCW, guys change personalities and turn on each other so often that there is no impact, no specialness, or incentive for fans to invest time getting behind any of the specific wrestlers. If Russo thinks he's an entertainment writer, maybe he should watch a show like Friends. The viewers all know the characters are take. This neither helps nor hurts the enjoyment of the show. The reason millions tune in, besides the humor, is that they love the characters and enjoy seeing them interact with each other, grow over time and develop while staying true to their relatively clearly defined personalities. If the guys each dated all the girls and all of them fought with each other for a couple of episodes and then everyone forgot about all this and started from scratch, we would lose interest quickly. If things that occurred last season, or even 2 seasons ago, were contradicted and ignored in the current storylines, the viewers of Friends would feel insulted. If Chandler in the middle of the show periodically shot off his mouth with vague references to his contract talks, or if Monica showed up and threw the WCW title belt in a garbage can, we would be confused and the ratings would suffer. Russo seems to think if all the above happened, we would be glued to the TV waiting for the next shock. Shock wears off quickly when there is no follow-up. The WWF has always done a great job of developing personalities and letting them interact within the clearly defined universe they live in. WCW is like fantasy wrestling. A bunch of guys booking angles for themselves with no concern about the long-term success of the product. Chris Jericho is the greatest example. He was getting over, despite a lack of a push, and he had his legs cut off from political reasons. He came to the WWF, and he's now a big star. WCW could do with a little soul-searching as to what they are doing wrong, as well as what WWF is doing right, instead of blaming the fans saying they don't get it. John Laub. I was listening to the Monday show and you talked about how people who were at the show complained about Canyon's fall, but people watching on TV didn't. Well, I watched it on TV and I immediately thought it was disgusting, given what happened to Owen. Michael Jenkinson. Edmonton, Alberta. I thought the TV angle with the paralyzed Chris Kanyon was quite distasteful. WCW handled this so badly. The casual fans probably didn't get the Owen Hart connection, but two groups of fans did, internet fans and the Kansas City wrestling fans who were at the event live. I know I was personally disgusted with it, as I am whenever Sting comes down from the rafters. To have EMTs swarm around Kanyon is completely wrong to do in front of the audience at Kemper Arena, especially when that is the ending of the show. Well, I guess that's WCW for you. Ryan Prepares. EMLL, I'd like to thank you for mentioning the March 17th EMLL pay-per-view show. The Atlantis vs. Viano Tercero match was just a masterpiece. It was move for move, hold for hold, non-stop wrestling action. The atmosphere of this family-oriented wrestling crowd was something I've never seen before. Sometimes when I watch wrestling on Monday night and see an inexperienced B-rate actor as world heavyweight champion and seeing one of the greatest Mexican wrestlers of all time doing a gimmick where he just passed his GED, I wonder why I even like wrestling. Seeing a match like that makes me very happy to be a wrestling fan. Leroy McCuff. ECW, why do ECW's ratings continue to lag? Perhaps ECW and its supporters should step back and take a sober look at whether recent decisions and current angles have been successful. Here are 10 things that Paul Heyman and his employees might consider. 1. Perhaps doing the title switch with Renta Taz to try and hurt WCW and Mike Awesome wasn't a good idea after all, since all they could show on ECW TV was Taz handing the belt to Tommy Dreamer like it was a piece of junk that a WWF midcarder no longer had any use for. 2. Perhaps strong-arming Lance Storm into a 30-day agreement and then burying him to try and hurt his value to WCW so they'd lose interest in him wasn't such a good idea after all since it pissed away the credibility of the ECW tag team titles. 3. Perhaps having Dreamer immediately jobbed to just incredible minutes after Taz handed Dreamer the belt wasn't such a good idea because the way the story played out on TV made Dreamer look worthless and weak. 4. Perhaps putting a stick girl on the stick isn't a good idea, period. 5. Perhaps the Sandman's delayed run-ins, where he takes 5 minutes to get to the ring, yet somehow still surprises the heels with cane shots, don't go over as well with TV viewers as they do with the live mob. 6. Perhaps Rob Van Dam's limp-ins, where he's obviously less than 100%, yes still kicks everyone's ass and clears the ring have destroyed the credibility of ECW's remaining heels. 7. Perhaps the irony of the insipid Sinister Minister skits, where some pudgy guy in an ugly red suit makes bad shoot jokes on WCW while doing something as embarrassing as any Vince Russo segment, is lost on TV viewers who find it hard to pat themselves on the back for being smart while allowing their intelligence to be insulted. 8. Perhaps the reason the WWF didn't want Cyrus is that he's really long-winded and tedious on the mic. 9. Perhaps the laughable network angle has turned away smart viewers while convincing misguided marks to boycott the evil TNN. 10. Or perhaps TV viewers have simply tired of endless look-alike matches with the requisite table spots, ladder spots, catfights and run-ins. Frank Jewett. San Jose, California. Whether it's the clash of titans in the ring or the drama that unfolds outside it, we're here to break it down, match by match, feud by feud. Remember, in the world of wrestling, every day is a battle, and every victory is a story waiting to be told. Until next time, keep the passion alive, and never stop wrestling with the possibilities. This is the Pro Wrestle Machine,